wait, did you see him physically? Did you touch him physically? Or was it your spiritual eyes and in a vision? Because to the world, there's a huge difference between seeing something in a vision and seeing something with your physical eyes and touching them with your physical hands.
But I would argue that all three of these men, particularly Oliver and David Whitmer, were highly respected by people in their community that knew that these were men of integrity, of sincerity, of honesty, and that they were very capable men as well, quite competent in you.
The church never taught us about these various, versions of what Martin did or didn't see. It was meticulously and thoughtfully and intentionally hid from all of us, which should also be its own witness. So
I feel like these accounts and these sources and these statements of the witnesses, that this is more of a historical scholarly approach. And also, if you're going to be critical of the church, all of the statements that I'm going to read at the end of the video, I have not heard from critics acknowledge, but they saw with their eyes and heard with their ears, that it was not juggling, a trick, a mental disturbance, a hallucination to them. They know it was real, and they stay true to their testimonies throughout their lives. Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. So in this episode, I'm going to be doing a response and an analysis of the LDS discussion episode that was done in Mormon Stories about the 3 witnesses of the gold plates. So I've done a fair amount of time researching the witnesses of the gold plates, both the 3 witnesses and the 8 witnesses. I've already done a few episodes on my channel. I had an interview with historian and critic Dan Vogel. I've read the work of Richard Lloyd Anderson. So I was really interested to watch this episode, and I felt the need to respond, either to push back on some things, also to share where maybe I appreciate some of their feedback or their comments, and just to provide more context of the testimony and the statements of the witnesses. And at the very end of the video, it's going to be about 45 minutes worth of me going through a lot of the statements I have found of the 3 witnesses, where I think they are very consistent, reaffirming that they know they saw the angel and the plates. And I'm doing this out of a need of informed consent, which John talks a lot about on his podcast. The purpose of the LDS discussion series is to make available all the data surrounding different truth claims or church history topics. However, I think to be balanced or to be objective, one should strive to provide the counter arguments or the apologetic arguments, which they try to do in some of their previous episodes, although I don't feel like they really dive into faithful scholarship or the apologetics as much as I do on my channel, really going into like academic articles or books on topics. But in this video, there wasn't a whole ton of trying to provide sort of counter arguments or looking into the apologetics. But I do credit at times where they do acknowledge some quotes of the witnesses which are more faithful statements. So I will give credit where I think credit is due. I also want to say that I think LDS Discussions has been a pretty good synthesis of a lot of the criticisms leveled against the church's truth claims. I think he's done a good job sort of accumulating that into his essays, kind of like similar to Mormon Think, going against the church, Joseph Smith, the Book of Mormon. And it was definitely an influence in me starting my own channel to really want to confront the criticisms leveled against the church's truth claims. I am maybe hoping to do a series in the future, maybe to bring on some expert and some scholars to specifically respond to maybe not all the episodes because they're really long, but the essays on LDS discussions, because there's been responses to like the CS letter and letter for my wife, but I feel like there needs to be one to this series because it's really popular, and I'm sure it's impacted a lot of people's faith. But I do often try to tackle or cover some of the things that he brings up in my own series or in my own interviews as well. But I think a specific series of someone like specifically responding to the essays would be really helpful. In this response video, I'm going to try my best to not be combative, to not engage in any ad hominem, to listen and try to understand their arguments, but respond in a way that I feel is direct, but also not in the spirit of contention, because I don't really appreciate when people do video responses and it can just be very combative and really going after the people and trying to make them seem like they're stupid. And I find those tactics quite unnecessary, and they can obfuscate from like the real issues. I also want to say that I can respect the people coming to different interpretations or different conclusions. I think it's just important to be clear and transparent about the data. And also, I want to give this disclaimer. I am a believer in the Book of Mormon and of the witnesses and their testimonies of the gold plate. So that is my bias. But it's important to acknowledge that it is, of course, understandable and rational and reasonable for someone to not believe in the Book of Mormon or accept the claims of the witnesses, the supernatural claims of seeing an angel and gold plates and hearing the voice of God. I totally understand somebody rejecting that, their testimony, or somebody who does not believe the Book of Mormon is historical and therefore does not believe the testimony of the witnesses. Of course, I cannot state that I know that what they experienced really happened. It is, of course, based upon faith and somebody having their own spiritual conviction and testimony of the Book of Mormon and believing in their statements and their testimony. However, I think it's really important for us to represent what they believed and what they said about their statements and to try to look at them all collectively and not just single out a few statements and to interpret their experience through that lens, to take them all in totality. And I also feel like I want to defend or represent the positive statements that people said about the witnesses' character or their competence. Obviously acknowledging even if they had characters of honesty and integrity, and people thought they were very successful in business or in politics or their professional career, does not negate the possibility of them being susceptible to having a mass vision or hallucination. But I think it's important to hear what other people had to say about their character when you're examining their credibility. And I will go over at the end many of their statements where they reaffirm over and over seeing the angels, seeing the plates, hearing the voice of God. To them, it was no trick, no hallucination, no delusion, no vain imagination of the mind. It was real to them. Whether or not it was real or not, it's important that we represent fairly and accurately and to provide as much of the data as we can on this topic. I think just trying to focus on quotes where they refer to spiritual eyes or vision, and that means it was not real, is how we may interpret it, but that is certainly not what the witnesses believed. And it's important that we don't misinterpret or misrepresent what they had to say in totality in their statements. For example, whenever I interviewed my friend Adam about his experience in the afterlife, there's no way that I can know that he really experienced what he did, but it's important, even if somebody dismisses it or rejects it, that we represent what he is saying accurately. I remember one person commented under my video saying that you can see from what Adam's saying that he actually went to hell, and he described Jesus wearing black robes, which is a sign that that was really the devil. And he totally twisted and misrepresented what Adam was saying. Adam did not claim that he saw Jesus in black robes or that he was in hell. He claimed that he was in heaven and that he saw Jesus, but that he wasn't wearing black robes. So even if you want to reject or not believe, it's important that we don't try to misinterpret or misrepresent what they're claiming. I will acknowledge that I will not be able to go through every single thing in their video. It was a 3.5 hour episode, but I've cut out maybe 2/3 to 3/4, but we will be covering a lot in there. So apologies, this will be a long episode, probably around the 3-hour mark. So stick with me, but I think this is going to be a very thorough analysis, and I'll also be taking little clips from previous episodes that I have done. Okay, let's dive in. Okay, so we're going to get into the meat of the episode. I'm going to play clips from the LDS Discussions episode about the 3 witnesses. I'm going to respond either if I agree, if I want to provide some context or my views or any pushback as well. And I'll put the link in as well if you want to watch their full episode. There's times where they may be going off on like maybe side tangents or talk about other topics. So I'm not going to be responding to those things, but just things which are centered around the 3 witnesses. And my forehead looks quite shiny. Right. I will share my screen, and I also have some snacks, as this is going to be fun. Okay. Hopefully this works.
All righty. So first slide.
Yeah. So first, I just want to give a little bit of a background for these. So in the Book of Mormon, there are 4 different times where the Book of Mormon references these witnesses. We don't have to read all of them, but it's either chapter 5 verses 3 through 4. Then you have 2 Nephi chapter 11 verse 3, And then 2 Nephi 27, it's referenced twice in verses 12 through 14.
And Julia, just so I understand, there's two options. One is that ancient Native American prophets etched these words into the golden plates, predicting that these three witnesses would bear witness to the Book of Mormon. That's option one. And then option two is that Joseph Smith is writing this book, and then he's thinking, how am I going to make people believe that I'm actually looking at plates when I didn't allow anyone to actually see the plates? In fact, I've hid them. I've either the place didn't exist or I meticulously hid them from everyone. How am I going to get people to believe it? And so as he's finishing the Book of Mormon, he comes up with this idea. I'm going to be showing them to three people, and or at least finding three people that I can convince to claim that they saw the plates, so that then there'll be additional witnesses in addition to me. Okay, Julia?
Okay, I'll pause there. So on that first clip, I do appreciate Julia showing the passages in the Book of Mormon where the Book of Mormon promises or prophesies that three witnesses would see the plates. It was in Ether, I think it was chapter 5. Let me just go back to her slide.
Yeah.
All right, so it was Ether 5, 2 Nephi 11, 2 Nephi 27. So three passages in the Book of Mormon. And a lot of people would criticize the prophecies in the Book of Mormon, that these are just easily backdated prophecies that Joseph Smith inserted, Jesus being born of Mary, or Christopher Columbus coming and discovering the Americas, or John the Baptist baptizing Jesus. But it's interesting because when it comes to the prophecies by the witnesses of the gold plates, this actually happened before the witnesses had their experience, because that happened in June 1829, which I think adds to it being more miraculous and impressive that Joseph, if he is the author, was able to prophesy this and pull this off. And of course, naturalistically, if Joseph Smith is the author, then yes, he's choosing three men to be his three witnesses to bolster the authenticity of the Book of Mormon. Now, when they say that nobody was ever allowed to see the plates, that is correct. He was told to conceal them and keep them hidden. But we do have the 8 witnesses who were shown and handled the plates, which we'll probably do another episode on. But also other informal witnesses who held and felt the plates wrapped in a cloth. And you've got other people like Mary Whitmer who claim to have some sort of a vision experience, or they were shown the plates.
Next slide.
Yeah, so this is just me because I was curious about the timeline about when so in my head, Joseph, this is a 19th century book, but you can see this just as an understanding, even if you are a member of the church or an active believing member, about when these come about, these in the text where they talk about the three witnesses. So the translation starts in early 1828. And then, so I guess about a year later, in April of 1829, Joseph Smith comes up with, or excuse me, the scriptures talk about there being three witnesses. So I was just curious about when that kind of happened. So
good correction saved there about Joseph Smith to the Book of Mormon there, Julia. Let's keep going. I think that's good timeline, because yeah, it's April 1829 to June 1829 is the translation of the Book of Mormon as we have it. So the witnesses' experience of the angel and the plates happens after the translation is complete. And by the way, you might be noticing that the quality of their video isn't as high quality as it was on their podcast. So I had to edit it, and whenever I tried to download it, I couldn't do it unless I really reduced the quality. So that's kind of why.
From God concerning the three witnesses. And so this happens in March of 1829. This is what's canonized now as Doctrine and Covenants section 5. And then again in April, D&C section 6. And then in June, he gets those where he gets the copyright the same month. Doctrine and Covenants 14 and Doctrine and Covenants 17 all talk about having these witnesses.
Let's get a visitation from who? From God and Jesus, or from Moroni, or who?
I think Joseph was clear that the angel Moroni would show up and he would show them the plates.
And so they're all kneeling in the forest with Joseph, Martin, Oliver, and David, and the angel doesn't show up.
Right.
Martin thinks he's the problem and he leaves. Keep going.
Yeah, so Martin goes, and so the rest continue praying, and then as they're praying, the angel does appear and shows them the plates. And then Joseph says that after they all obtain their witness, he goes and he finds Martin praying, and then he prays with Martin, and then Martin is able to see the angel with the plates, and he says, it is enough, like I've seen, and he gives this sort of testimony. So that's just the canonized history of the church. You'll see it in their videos and in obviously the history of the church. So
yeah, I agree with that so far. That was a good overview. Let's see what they say next.
It does smack a lot of Joseph Smith's days of treasure digging. The idea that the necessary requirements for the thing to happen are shifting and ever changing, and it required him to isolate an individual in order for them to get the special witness, and they were taken out as the problem. And it's that person then didn't see what the others saw, so it's not a collective group, and it's kind of that divide and conquer, giving people certain bits of information.
Well, I don't see like Martin Harris having to separate from the others, that this really calls into question the credibility of the statement of the three witnesses having their experience, because they still had to have two visions, even if Martin was separated from them. But I know critics would probably see this as, oh, well, this shows that Joseph needed to be there. There was some sort of hypnosis required, and that, you know, similar to treasure digging, oh, if it's not happening, then there's something going wrong in the procedure or in the ritual. But I don't think, like, just because they, you know, were engaged in sort of like this folk magic culture and engaged in treasure digging, that this is therefore equivalent to that sort of thing. It's important to be aware of that context. But I don't think the fact that Martin separated really has any bearing on the authenticity of their testimony.
The people Joseph Smith is selecting are all involved in this world of treasure digging. They believe that you can find treasure with rocks, and that with a rod you can find water. So you got to keep that in mind when you kind of think about Martin Harris and Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer, because they are all believers already. They're primed for this.
And I know Julie's going to cover that later. Okay, the one thing I was just going to add, one of the revelations that Grant Palmer gave to me, academic revelations, not spiritual revelations, was this idea of spiritualize versus physicalize. And I'm sure Julie's going to talk about that later. But it's this idea of, did an actual corp, because in Mormonism, angels and God and Jesus are resurrected beings if they've died, and then they're often reappearing. And visitations are real. You're not just caught up in a vision. You're seeing actual physical beings. Joseph Smith literally saw God and Jesus with his eyes, and they were corporeal physical beings. And already, why would Martin Harris, if Angel Moroni appears presumably as a resurrected being, why would Martin struggle to see him? He's either physically there or not. And if Joseph and Oliver and David can see him, then Martin could see him, whether or not Martin's having indigestion or a bad day. So already this is making me wonder if this is kind of the spiritualized idea. And Fawn Brody talks about this later. Fawn Brody talks about this in No Man Knows My History, that her theory is that maybe Joseph was able to whip people up into sort of concocting in their brain a vision, sort of like, can you see it now? Let me describe it to you. Can you see it now? And then people would, in their mind's eye, see it, versus an actual being appearing and seeing it with their physical eyes. And this is already starting to make me wonder that it's probably not the physical appearance.
That being
okay. So my response to that. So he's sort of implying that for them, in order to have the vision, that Joseph selected people who had this visionary mindset and were open to visions of angels. They were engaged in folk magic and treasure digging. I think that's one of the arguments that Dan Vogel gave to me, that, you know, both Martin Harris, David Whitmer, and Oliver Cowdery were all sort of believing in the Book of Mormon and believed in this work and had some sort of spiritual experiences prior to going to the woods and, you know, seeing the angel in the plates. So maybe they were primed to have more of a hallucination. And he's also implying, you know, Fawn Brody's theory, people like Grant Palmer as well, that Joseph had some sort of unconscious skill of hypnosis and was able to work people into having visions and sort of guiding them through a mystical experience. And he mentioned, you know, Grant Palmer, who was a big influence for me whenever I was first in my faith crisis, about, you know, they saw with spiritual eyes, or it was second sight, they saw with the eyes of their understanding, which therefore they didn't really see the angel in the plate. It wasn't a real visitation, it was just in their mind. And as I'll talk about later, as I go through a lot of their first or second-hand statements, they, over and over, the vast majority of their statements, they make it very apparent and clear that the angel came before them, that they saw with their eyes and heard with their ears. So I think if we represent the witnesses' testimony collectively and look at it in totality, they are very adamant that it was a visionary, but a visitation, that the angel came down and appeared before them. But you'll notice in this video that they want to try to focus it all on, well, it was just second sight and spiritual eyes, so they didn't really see the angel in the plates, and tend to just focus on the quotes that support that.
dated later. Because Joseph was saying in the other revelation that they're going to see, I don't know how many other items, the Sword of Laban, the Liahona, the Urim and Thummim. But the witnesses, when they sign the document, they say they only see the two things, the gold plates with engravings and the angel. And okay, so these are just some facts about the statements. So in both of the witnesses' statements, the 3 and the 8, there is no date given or time of day or location for the event. Each of the witnesses signed an already written statement. And then this is something that's just interesting. Originally, as you can see, the witnesses' statements are published at the end of the book originally, whereas today they're published at the very beginning of the book. So that they're the first thing people see, but back, I don't know why Joseph did it that way, but it's smarter to move it to the front, but
Okay.
I just think that's interesting.
A comment I wanted to give as well, when they talked about how Martin Harris had to separate in order to say, like, why couldn't Martin Harris have just stayed and the angel just appeared? I think it's in Doctrine and Covenants 5, and I've read this kind of recently, that the Lord said in the revelation to Martin Harris that unless he exercises faith and repents and humbles himself, confesses his sins, he will not have a view of these things. So it appears that the angel would not appear unless they were humbly praying and in a position of confessing their sins. And maybe Martin in that moment felt like he didn't have enough faith. He had to remove himself before the angel could come. The question about like none of the witnesses signing their statement, it was already printed statement and their names were already signed to it. There's statements from the witnesses where, number one, there's an account from David Whitmer where he talks about that he signed his name to the testimony of the 3 witnesses, but we don't have the original manuscript. And according to David Whitmer, each of the 3 witnesses added their signatures to the original Book of Mormon manuscript. When he was being interviewed by, and there's others there as well, he was asked if the 3 witnesses signed their own names to the testimony of the Book of Mormon, and he replied, yes, we each signed his own name. Then they then said, how is it that the names of all the witnesses are found here written in the same handwriting? This question seemed to startle Father Whitmer, and after examining the signatures, he replied, Oliver must have copied them. Then where are the original documents, was asked. He replied, I don't know. I don't think this is a big deal because so many of the other witnesses say that the testimony that is found in the official testimony of the 3 witnesses at the beginning of the Book of Mormon is true, and so many of their other statements later support and re-emphasize it. So I don't think it's a big deal that in the printer's manuscript that this was copied in Oliver Cowdery's handwriting.
Okay.
And then another note is, with the exception of Martin Harris, all of the witnesses were related to the Whitmers or the Smiths. So Oliver Cowdery was married to Elizabeth Ann Whitmer, and then you have David Whitmer, Christian Whitmer, Jacob Whitmer, Peter Whitmer, John Whitmer, Hiram Page, who was married to Catherine Whitmer, and then you have Joseph Smith Sr., Hiram Smith, and Samuel Smith.
Wow. So
Right.
it seems like it's basically 2 families, the Smith family and the Whitmer family.
And then Martin, right. Yeah.
And then Martin, who we'll talk about later what his motives might have been. But I mean, I guess it's a foreshadowing of credibility if it's just like a family thing, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Family job.
I think it's interesting the point that they're insinuating here, because the main critical theory or view for the witnesses is that they were sincere, but they were tricked, they were duped by Joseph Smith having a fake set of metal plates. They'll talk about this in the next episode. They believe that the 8 witnesses saw covered in a cloth, so they didn't actually see the plates. It was a supernatural seeing, which we won't get into in this episode, and that the 3 witnesses had some sort of a mass hallucination or a hypnosis experience. But there's trying to imply here that because a lot of them were all related with each other, either the Whitmers or the Smiths, you have Oliver Cowdery as well, who's a cousin of the Smiths, and then Martin Harris, they're almost trying to imply like, oh, they were all related to each other, makes it seem more like a conspiracy, which again would that contradicts it being a mass hallucination. Either they're part of a conspiracy and they're conspiring, or they were sincere dupes and hallucinated. Like, I suppose could maybe be a bit of both, but I don't think that really works, especially as a lot of the witnesses leave the church and believe Joseph was a fallen prophet for a time, but none of them deny, which I definitely think they would have if they conspired. Or they could have at least been like, oh, well, I think Joseph tricked us or deceived us or did some sort of hypnosis after the fact. Now, of course, you could argue that these men, they're all family, they're all related, and because they all have this magical worldview and visionary mindset, then that might call into question their credibility. But I think just trying to imply that because they're all sort of friends or related, and then they all claim to be witnesses, that therefore makes them more unreliable. That is a different argument from arguing for hallucination or being dupes. You're implying from that they are co-conspirators with Joseph, which no serious critics would hold that position.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Should we go to the next slide?
Sure. Okay, so this is something that I found really interesting. So all of the signatures, if you look at the witness statements themselves on the Joseph Smith papers, all of them are in Oliver Cowdery's handwriting. So while one could argue that the original 3 and 8 witnesses signed what was on the original manuscript for the Book of Mormon and not what was in the printer's manuscript, which is what the pictures are here, there is little evidence that such a document ever existed.
No, I mean, I remember reading this when I first read the CS letter way back when, and I remember reading the Fair Mormon response. They basically say, well, if you think that's a big deal, it's just because you don't understand that the printer's manuscript was lost, and apparently we think that it was originally signed by them. And it's kind of like one of those games where it's like, well, we can't know, so we're just going to assume everything's fine. There are the responses that none of the 11 call out Joseph Smith for signing for them, so they're saying it's not like they disagreed with it. So this is one of those areas where you could kind of take your own path as to how you want to frame it, because we don't have it, so we just don't know.
Right.
I appreciate Mike saying that, because yeah, we don't have the original manuscript. I read the account from David Whitmer where he talks about all 3 of the 3 witnesses signing their names to it. But yeah, none of the 3 or 8 witnesses criticize the official statement or having their names written. I lean towards that. I think this was a copy by Oliver Cowdery, but this would have been in the original manuscript. But none of them call them out. None of them say that the testimony in the official 3 or 8 witnesses in the Book of Mormon is incorrect or a misrepresentation. In fact, we have accounts from John Whitmer, David Whitmer, and others that say that testimony is true, and they stay true to it. And even when John Whitmer is like most disillusioned with the church and Joseph Smith, and he's asked by Theodore Turley, like, how can you like believe Joseph is a fallen prophet when you're one of the witnesses of the gold plates? He says like, well, yeah, I saw and handled them, but I don't know whether the characters or the engravings or the translation's correct. I don't know if they're authentic characters, but he never denied seeing and handling the plates. So even then, that would have a prime opportunity to call out Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery for writing their names down if they didn't agree with that testimony. If they didn't agree with the official testimony at the start of the Book of Mormon.
Yeah. On the one hand, it seems sketchy that it's all one person's handwriting. On the other hand, they apparently never denied it. So what does all that matter, right?
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
Okay. All right. What does Fawn Brody have to say about this, Julia?
Okay, so in her book, No Man Knows My History, Fawn Brody pointed out that according to the local press at the time, the 3 witnesses all told different versions of their experience. A fact that makes it all more likely that the men were not conspirators, but victims of Joseph's unconscious but positive talent of hypnosis. So I thought that was, yeah. And
I do highly recommend No Man Knows My History for those who want someone who had really direct access to the source documents. And Nemo's showing it to you now. I think it's the best biography ever written on Joseph Smith. That's my opinion.
So my response to that is that, so she's saying that Joseph had some unconscious ability to hypnotize people and have men see visions that they would never deny. There's not evidence that Joseph had this skill or ability to hypnotize, but of course you would have to view it that way if so many people are having visions in Joseph Smith's presence. And people can't be hypnotized against their own will as well. And the fact that they had this hallucinatory visionary experience, that was a result of Joseph Smith hypnotizing them. But even after Joseph Smith's death and decades after, they still are adamant that they saw the angel, they saw the plates, that it wasn't a trick or a hallucination to them. That's quite remarkable. And I don't feel like we can just attribute the witnesses' experience and the dozens of statements that we're going to read from them to, well, this was just Joseph, he had this skill of hypnosis. It's possible, I just don't find it persuasive.
Okay.
Okay, so I just wanted to point these out as well. So according to a presentation given by Richard Lloyd Anderson during a fair conference in 2004, he gave some numbers for the Book of Mormon witnesses where, quote, where they said something about the Book of Mormon. And he says, and I don't know the numbers, so that's why I'm pulling from him, anyway. So he says Martin Harris was interviewed 50 times, and Oliver Cowdery was interviewed 30 times throughout their lives, and then David Whitmer was interviewed a minimum of 70 times. And so while I don't quite follow his math, Richard Lloyd Anderson says, quote, so I've got about 200 times when one of the witnesses said, I did sign the statement, quote, the statement means what it says, quote, I saw the angel, quote, I saw the plates, or in the case of the 8 witnesses, quote, I handled the plates. So 200 very positive and specific statements in many cases, and I'm dealing today, this is during his presentation, with about 8 or 10 documents, in other words, 5%. And the question is, do you believe the 95% or do you believe the 5%? So I say, while he is correct that 8 or 10 documents give a different answer as to whether the witnesses saw the angel in the plates, the question in my mind of these documents is not whether to believe the 5% over the 95%. The question is, does the 5% change our understanding of the 95%?
Okay, tell us what you mean by that.
So like later we'll see this 5% or these 10 or 11 documents, they say that they only saw the plates in a vision. And even one time David Whitmer says, of course it was in a vision. That's how you see spiritual things. And like, if you frame it all with that mindset, like this is how Joseph Smith, like you're talking about with Mike, with Sidney Rigdon, this is how Joseph views revelations. This is how he walks other people through revelations, is through visions, or through, yeah. And so like, that's just how, anyway, so seeing the 5 kind of helps you reframe the 95% is what I mean.
Okay, first of all, I, in clarifying his statement about there being nearly 200 documents, so if we go back to the slide that they had, Martin Harris interviewed 50 times, Oliver Cowdery 30, David Whitmer 70 times. What they omit is he has about 42 statements from the 8 witnesses, so 150 plus 42 would be the near 200s. So he's including the 200 statements, including the 8 witnesses as well. But I appreciate that they're acknowledging that they're focusing on 5% of the total statements of the witnesses. And personally, I feel, because whenever I first was in my faith crisis and read like Mormon Thing or the CES letter or Grant Palmer's book, I had only read the testimony of the 3 and the 8 witnesses. So whenever I was exposed to those, 8 or 10 statements that talk about spiritual eyes, or I didn't really see the place, I saw them as I see a city through a mountain, or the plates were covered in a cloth, Martin Harris saw Jesus in the form of a deer. When I looked at those quotes, I was like, man, like the witnesses aren't credible. They didn't really see the plates. It was all spiritual eyes or in their mind. These guys aren't credible. They're religious nuts. And I interpreted the official testimony through these other statements. I thought like, oh, you have to look at these other statements, what they're saying. I'm realizing that the testimony of the 3 witnesses at the front of the Book of Mormon and of the 8 isn't credible. And I interpret it in light of these other statements. However, if you're interpreting the witnesses' experience based on a few second or third hand statements, and you're omitting the vast majority of their first and second hand statements, which we will read later, where they are so consistent with their official testimony at the beginning of the Book of Mormon, I think that's troubling. And yeah, we shouldn't discount, we shouldn't ignore the 5%. They are data points as well, but to privilege them over all of their others, you need to look at them collectively.
And so like, that's just how, anyway, so seeing the 5 kind of helps you reframe the 95% is what I mean.
I disagree, but okay.
Okay. Mike, do you have a response to Anderson at all?
No, I think we did an episode on apologetics, and this is kind of that thing where, I mean, I don't want to say I know that.
I just want to pause. So like, say if I give 20 statements about my, like, say, coming back to the church story, for example, and 19 of them are very consistent. Some of them have more detail than other, but 19 are very consistent. It's different interviews that I have. And there's one which seems like an anomaly where I talk about like, I didn't really, experience what I did, like it's very different to the others and it seems less miraculous or inconsistent. I feel like people should be cautious to just take that one experience and discount all the others.
They love to use the term gish gallop, which is where you throw a bunch of stuff together. It doesn't all quite work, but because you're giving a lot, it really makes it seem like a stronger argument. And I think what he's doing is he's trying to deflect by saying it's just a few statements. We don't have to worry about it. It would be like saying the Book of Mormon is 270,000 words. So it doesn't matter that they changed 50 words that change our complete meaning of God, because the other 272,950 are the same. It doesn't matter, because what Julia said is true. What the differences are is how we can better understand and kind of recreate what might have happened. And so it really is more of a deflection than it is anything else.
Yeah, what he's trying to do is create a false binary by saying that we have to put these 95% against the 5% because they're at odds with each other, they're fighting each other, which is not the case at all. You would look at all the source documents available and you look at what they say in their entirety together about the circumstance. So you'll say, okay, what we can actually tell from that is on 95% of occasions, they didn't go into the level of detail where they would state that it was a spiritual vision or etc. But on 5% of occasions, they did give that further detail. They don't contradict one another. It's just that they weren't as detailed in 95% of cases.
So I wonder if they've actually read all of the statements from the witnesses, the 150. I disagree with that, because they're trying to say, like, okay, the quotes that talk about spiritual eyes or eyes of faith, that is them providing more detail. So then all the other ones, they don't get into any detail. They're just very vague about seeing and handling the plates. And that's totally wrong. And whenever we go through the statements at the end of it, you will see that I think there's ways to harmonize, because the terms like spiritual eyes and vision and eye of faith, these are scriptural terms. So of course, them seeing the angel, that there's going to be some supernatural visionary element to it, a brilliant light. If there was no visionary component to it, I think people often get really worked up over like vision versus visitation. To them, it was real, and they describe it as the angel coming down and descending in the midst of them. But there are so many statements where they talk about seeing with their eyes, hearing with their ears, that it was real. It was not a vain imagination. It wasn't just a deception or a mental disturbance or a hallucination. And there's so many statements where they talk about like seeing with these eyes, hearing with these ears. So to discount all those statements and just focus on the few second or third hand that talk about spiritual eyes, and then to take from that oh, the witnesses don't really believe the angel came and appeared, they just saw it in their mind, isn't a fair representation.
I mean, honestly, if this were a murder trial and the person accused of murder 95 times said he didn't do the murder, but then 5 times he said he did do the murder, would we just go with the 95 over the 5?
Well, exactly. Or in 95% of interviews, he said, I was at home doing X, Y, and Z. But in 5% of them, he said, I was at home doing X, Y, and Z, and then adds an extra detail that actually indicts him. That extra detail matters.
It does. It does.
Right.
I don't feel like that's a fair equivalent at all, but especially the one that John gave. I would see it more as like, so I've been on different podcasts talking about like what brought me back to the church. And why don't we give the example of Sam interviewed 20 times and they record it, right? So it's not a live recording of me. And let's just say in 19 of them, I'm quite consistent about the things that brought me back. There was things with apologetics, there's Stand Forever talk. I went back, fasted and prayed. And I read through different scripture passages, which I interpreted as revelation. That's why it came back. And if in 19 of those, they're very consistent. But if you have one person that were to say that I had an interview with him and Stephen said he came back to the church because he just wanted to find a wife and he just missed the church and those sorts of things, and sort of really changed or dumbed down my reasons for coming back, yeah, you shouldn't ignore it. But if it's only one compared to all the others that are very consistent, I think you should be more cautious.
I also wanted to just add something really quickly. It mentions in the statement of the witnesses, and they have been shown unto us by the power of God and not of man. To me, that's important language, because if they're physical beings and they're physical plates and they're just being shown, why does there need to be the power of God involved? It's just their physical being showing up and you're touching the plates and you're seeing the angel. And so to me, that's code word for spiritual eyes, seeing the vision in your mind, but not actually seeing something physical. So it's kind of like they want it both ways. They want to be able to give a disclaimer that, it was, a vision or by the power of God, but then they will also want to make it sound like it's super physical and super real. The only other point that I wanted to make is, why are they being interviewed 150 times? Why are people asking them over and over and over and over and over and over again? To me, that suggests that there's so much uncertainty or ambiguity that journalists continue to try and figure out, wait, did you see him physically? Did you touch him physically? Or was it your spiritual eyes and in a vision? Because to the world, there's a huge difference between seeing something in a vision and seeing something with your physical eyes and touching them with your physical hands. And the fact that they were interviewed 150 times or whatever suggests that people remained unsure until their deaths, maybe.
Okay, so my response to that, them saying that it was shown to them by the power of God, not of man, I think they're trying to emphasize that this was shown to them by an angel. It was shown to them through a heavenly vision / visitation, that this was not just Joseph Smith showing them the plates. And I think like people are getting caught up because like they're using language of vision. But I personally think it would be more concerning if they claimed an angel came, but it was just a regular man who just held these plates, and there was no like heavenly brilliant light component to it, that they weren't sort of transfigured and filled with the Spirit. Because then you might think, was this just Sidney Rigdon, as people in Mormonism Veiled said? Did he just show up and show the plates? Like there is no heavenly element to it. So I think they're kind of getting caught up. I think the witnesses are trying to emphasize that this was the power of God, that this was a visionary, miraculous thing that they were shown it. They were shown it by an angel, and they heard the voice of God. It wasn't Joseph just playing a trick on them. And also about like, why are they being interviewed like 150 times? Like, of course, people are going to be skeptical. Like, even if the witnesses never use the language of vision, if they said like, and there's times where they do say like the angel appeared and came down, like, and their statements were like, they talk about like, yeah, seeing them with their natural eyes, but they were in the Spirit also, and that their natural eyes were prepared. So I feel like we get make too much of a deal over vision visitation. Oh, vision means it wasn't real. Like whatever it was real to them. But of course, people inquire about it because that's a supernatural claim, and people are going to be skeptical and want to ask questions and be curious about their experience. So I don't think the fact that they were questioned 150 times calls into question the credibility. If anything, it's great that we have so many statements from them, because it enriches and shows actually a lot of the consistency of their testimony, which we will get to at the end of the video.
So let's start with Martin Harris.
So there's a lot on Martin Harris because to me, he's the most problematic. And I made TikToks about this as well, but I'll try to sum it up as best I can. So before joining the Mormon Church, Martin Harris was a Quaker, a Universalist, a Restorationist, a Methodist, and belonged to Palmyra's Zion Episcopal Church.
So that's getting to the point that he was a seeker, or he was like flaky and he never met a church or a prophet that he didn't like. Is that the point you're making there?
Right. Like he was baptized into 5 different churches and things like that. Like he's looking for something.
And we'll talk about what he joined after Mormonism too.
Right,
Okay.
right.
All right, go ahead.
And then in 1831, the Jamestown Journal, and this is online, published that Martin Harris had seen Jesus Christ, and that Jesus was the handsomest man he had ever seen. And that he also saw the devil, and that he was, quote, a very sleek-haired fellow with 4 feet and a head like a jackass, unquote. And in 1840, Martin claimed...
Martin says that the devil was a jackass and had back hair?
Yeah, like I guess the head of a donkey with sleek hair.
All right.
Right.
All right.
And then in 1840, Martin claimed to have walked and talked with Jesus Christ for an hour while Jesus was in the form of a deer. And this is also published in the newspaper.
Okay.
And then according to G.W. Stoddard, Martin Harris was fretful, peevish, and quarrelsome, and he's a resident where he lives, Stoddard. And that Martin Harris would frequently abuse his wife. And according to Martin's wife, Lucy, Martin had a very quick temper, and he had frequent angry fits and would often abuse her. He would use a bullwhip. And she says, quote, in one of his fits of rage, he struck me with the butt end of a whip. My flesh was black and blue in many places, unquote. And then according to Lucy, Martin Harris was also cheating on her with a neighbor. He would go and spend all night there while her husband was gone. According to Martin Harris's sister-in-law, Abigail, Martin had got into the gold Bible business to make money. He's quoted as saying, or she remembers him saying, quote, what if it is a lie? If you would let me alone, I would make money out of it. And then Martin funded most of the Book of Mormon publication and thought that he would get greater returns on its sale. He thought the plates would also be displayed and that the people would be charged 25 cents to view them, which is the equivalent today of $8.43. And he was disappointed that the angel set the sale price for the Book of Mormon at $1.75, which actually today, with inflation, is $59. And then the angel reduced the price to $1.25, which is today $42 roughly. And Martin also prophesied many false things, like there would be no president after so many, I can't remember who the last one was. And then after so many years, everyone would convert to Mormonism, which those things didn't happen in the 1840s when he said that they would happen. And then he was corrected on many occasions for teaching false doctrine by Joseph corrected him because he was teaching false doctrine.
Okay, well,
right, I don't have a response to all of that, but you know, they're focusing on statements of people like these. None of these are first hand from Joseph. They could still be true, you know, coming second, third hand from people like him seeing Jesus in the form of a deer. And we do know that Martin did move from, you know, different religions as well after leaving Mormonism. A lot of them being maybe Mormonism breakoff groups, or you know, joined the Shakers for a while. He did never deny the testimony of the Book of Mormon. I remember one of the arguments Grant Palmer gave is that he was just superstitious and really gullible, and he just believed everything, and he was this religious fanatic. So it's not that he never denied, but he just believed everything. And I think they're trying to show, I think it's good, like present those accounts, those sources that are a little bit more antagonistic towards Martin. I'm not going to fight on whether any of them have any validity or not. But they also omitted some of the statements people made about his character as well that are sort of positive towards him being an industrious farmer and him having a character of honesty and integrity, despite people being skeptical about him being one of the witnesses of the gold plates. So I'm going to share a little bit of that. So this comes from Fair. So even early anti-Mormons who knew Harris believed that he was honest and industrious, benevolent, and a worthy citizen. Early anti-Mormons who knew Harris, or those who were acquainted with Harris, believed that he was honest and industrious and benevolent and a worthy citizen. Wrote the local paper on Harris's departure with the Saints. It writes, several families, numbering about 50 souls, took up their line of march from this town last week for the Promised Land, among whom was Martin Harris, one of the original believers in the Book of Mormon. Mr. Harris was among the early settlers of this town and has ever borne the character of an honourable and upright man, an obliging and benevolent neighbour. He had secured to himself by honest industry a respectable fortune, and he has left a large circle of acquaintances and friends to pity his delusion. So before Harris became one of the witnesses and left with the Saints from New York, he was considered an honourable, upright man. He had good character. He was a good, respected farmer. And they're almost confused. He's given this up his farm and, follow this delusion. Pomeroy Tucker, who knew Harris but didn't believe in the Book of Mormon, once noted, how to reconcile the act of Harris in signing his name to such a statement, his testimony of the Book of Mormon, in view of the character of honesty which had always been conceded to him, could never easily be explained. So these two accounts are supporting Martin Harris having a character of honesty and being respected by people. This is the letter of W.W. Phelps to E.D. Howe in January of 1831. Mr. Harris, whose name is in the book, is a wealthy farmer, but of small literary acquirements. He is honest and sincerely declares upon his soul salvation that the book is true. And Martin as well, while he did join a lot of churches, I think people are trying to make him sound like he was this real gullible dupe, but we do see signs of skepticism. For example, Martin waited until his wife and daughter had made personal inquiries first regarding the story of the gold plates and the angel. When he visited, before he became scribe, he talked with the Smiths separately to see if their stories agreed, to see if there's any inconsistencies. He then proceeded to lift the box containing the plates, which he concluded must have contained metal as heavy as lead or gold, and he knew that Joseph had not credit enough to buy so much lead. And even during the translation of the Book of Mormon, there's the account where Martin Harris swaps the stone with another stone as a way to test Joseph that he's not just reciting from memory what he's dictating in the Book of Mormon. Martin's character as well. So people try to say that he had some financial motive for the success of the Book of Mormon, but we have no evidence for a financial bias. While Martin gave money for the printing of the Book of Mormon, there's no evidence of him getting any contractual relationship, any profits that he ever benefited. In fact, there's a quote that we're going to read later where he says that had he have denied his testimony of the Book of Mormon, he could have been a rich man, but he never did. So it's important to at least take these statements and quotes into account when you're weighing up Martin's character as well, which they obviously left out. They're going to talk next about Oliver Cowdery.
So Nemo, do you want to read this one?
Yeah, he looks like a fine, upstanding fellow. Oliver Cowdery was a clerk, teacher, justice of the peace, a lawyer, and a newspaper editor. He was raised as a Congregationalist. He lived in Poultney, Vermont, which is also where Ethan Smith lived, author of View of the Hebrews. In an 1829 revelation that was later edited, it said that Oliver had the gift of working with the sprout, or in other words, a divining rod.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because, again, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but when you hear apologists, especially, or the church about Oliver Cowdery, they talk about being like this really intellectual, respected person. I think he was. The dude thought he could walk with a piece of wood and find water in the ground by having it twitch in his arms. That is, today, if you went to a ward and said, there's this guy, he walks around with a piece of wood, he thinks he can find water in the ground, they'd be like, that guy's a nut job. This is what I'm trying to say. Like, I'm not trying to defame these people. I'm just saying this is common at the time. And even people that may have been respectable in other ways are kind of believing in things that are crazy. And Oliver Cowdery, when he goes to Joseph, is claiming, after he hears about the plates, he claims to be having dreams about the plates. They talk about how he's obsessed with the translation process. So it's not like Oliver Cowdery's like this lawyer's like, oh, sure, I'll be your scribe. This guy was obsessed. He was all in and believed in all of this magical stuff. And people like to strip that away, but you can't. Like, this is when you talk about Oliver Cowdery. Yes, he was, I think he was the most respected, or certainly more than Martin Harris. But there are a lot of things that allowed him to be primed for this testimony and to be a part of this. And I will note, and this might not be as relevant to this part, but we do know that Oliver Cowdery was willing to make stuff up and to go along with lies in order to benefit himself and the church, which we talked about in the priesthood restoration episode. So while he may not have been willing to do that in 1829, we don't know, but he was willing to do it throughout his time in the church.
Okay, so response to that. So I can understand that people saying, well, if he believed in divining rods, that this sounds very folk magic-y. Like, people believed in folk magic back then. And there's even still people today who would use dowsing rods in trying to find water and stuff. And I'm not going to comment because it's sort of pseudoscience, but some people claim they work, some people don't. But just because he believed in divining rods, I don't think necessarily means he's completely not credible. Yes, I think Mike is right, and I think it's a fair statement. You could say that Oliver had his own dreams, and he fully believed in the Book of Mormon project, in the divinity of the works. You could say that he was spiritually primed to have a vision or hallucination of the angel in the plates. And I appreciate them acknowledging that he was, a lawyer and a school teacher, and he was very respected, and people believed that he did have honest character and integrity. And we're going to read some of the quotes as well, which aren't included. So I got this from Fair. So William Lang, who apprenticed in Cowdery's law office, knew him for many years. Lang was a member of the Ohio Bar and served as prosecuting attorney, probate judge, mayor of Tiffin, county treasurer, and 2 terms in the Ohio Senate. He was nominated by his party for major state offices twice. This is what he wrote of Cowdery. Mr. Cowdery was an able lawyer and a great advocate. His manners were easy and gentlemanly. He was polite, dignified, yet courteous. With all his kind and friendly disposition, there was a certain degree of sadness that seemed to pervade his whole being. His association with others was marked by the great amount of information his conversation conveyed and the beauty of his musical voice. His addresses to the court and jury were characterized by a high order of oratory with brilliant and forensic force. He was modest and reserved, never spoke ill of anyone, never complained. Harvey Gibson, who was a political opponent of Oliver's and another lawyer, he wrote, Cowdery was an able lawyer, an agreeable, irreproachable gentleman. After moving to Wisconsin for less than a year, he was nominated as state assemblyman. Given the unpopularity of Mormonism, it is notable that his Democratic associates responded and argued that he was a man of sterling integrity, sound and vigorous intellect, and every way worthy, honest, and capable. Upon hearing that Cowdery's testimony was the basis of personal attacks in Wisconsin, John Breslin from Ohio immediately published an article deploring the baseness of such a course and insisted on the capability and integrity of Oliver. And I got this from LDS Truth Claims, the episode and the resources that he has on Oliver Cowdery. Mr. Cowdery was a resident among us for a period of 7 years, during which time he earned himself an enviable distinction at the bar of this place and of this judicial circuit. As a sound and able lawyer and as a citizen, none could have been more esteemed. His honesty, integrity, and industry were worthy of the imitation of all, whilst his unquestioned legal abilities reflected credit as well upon himself as upon the profession of which he was a member. Friends who knew him in Tiffin wrote, his numerous acquaintances at this place will receive the tidings of his decease with much regret. He was a man of more than ordinary ability. During his residence among us, he had endeared himself to all who knew him in private and social walks of life. So he was very successful, as a lawyer. He was respected and viewed as a man of integrity, of competence, of honesty. Now, that doesn't negate the possibility of having this visionary mindset and possibly having a hallucination, but certainly he was viewed as a man of integrity and of intelligence as well, and was very successful in his professional career. Okay, let's look at what they say about David Whitmer.
That's Oliver Cowdery, and now let's look at David Whitmer.
Mike, do you want to read about David?
David Whitmer was born in Pennsylvania, but his family was born in Germany. Before converting to Mormonism, the Whitmer family belonged to the German Reformed Church. David Whitmer believed in seer stones and had at least 2 of them himself.
All right, what's
Okay, and some things that maybe they didn't talk about with David Whitmer, and again, what people in his community had to say about his honesty and his character. So I will put that up now. So I got this from LDS Truth Claims. So his community involvement, first mention of him is a bachelor farmer of 20 was when he was elected as sergeant in the newly organized militia company. He served on fair boards. He was named in newspapers as participating in public meetings and being elected as chairman. In 1858, he was nominated for city councilman. He was elected to fill an unexpired term of mayor from 1867 to 68. And the Ray County Atlas of 1877, or Atlas, the Ray County Atlas of 1877 features his picture as one of the most 20 influential individuals. So he was highly respected in his community, participated on fair boards, public meetings, even served as mayor as well. Upon his death, the local newspaper wrote, "He lived in Richmond about a half century, and we can say that no man ever lived here who had among our people more friends and fewer enemies. He was honest, conscientious, and upright in all his dealings, just in his estimate of men, and open, manly, and frank in his treatment of all. He made lasting friends who loved him to the end." So people in his community had really positive things to say about his character, his honesty, being very kind and having lots of friends and people that respected him, despite him always remaining true to his testimony as well. After his election as mayor, it induced some criticism. The Richmond Conservator, under the direction of Jacob Child, wrote, "Mr. Whitmer is a gentleman and as such represented the views of our people when they cast him for their votes." Although admitting that his theological views and his claims were open to question, the journalist Jacob Child insisted that the reputation of David was not. If of life, of probity, of unobtrusive benevolence and well-doing for well nigh a half century marks a man as a good citizen, then David Whitmer should enjoy the confidence and esteem of his fellow men. After John Whitmer interviewed David in 1880 and basically claimed his denial, David printed a proclamation that he had never modified his written testimony. He also enlisted 22 of Richmond's political, business, and professional leaders to sign an accompanying statement that they had known him for over 40 years as a man of the highest integrity, of undoubted truth and veracity. One person said that nobody could know Uncle Davy and not like and trust him. Children like him, men respected him and trusted him, and I have never heard a word from anyone during my 10 years acquaintance with him, and those who had known him intimately for years, that spoke a harsh word or uttered a doubt as to his truthfulness and general kindness of heart. From Mormon reminiscences, few of his townsmen could accept his Book of Mormon testimony, but according to Parker, on any other subject or statement of fact, neither myself or others could doubt. Parker had never met a more honest, guileless man. How one can account for the delusion that must have possessed this old man is beyond me. And a Democrat wrote, "No man ever lived here who had among our people more friends and fewer enemies. He was honest, conscientious, and upright in all his dealings, just in his estimate of men, and open, manly, frank in his treatment of all. He made lasting friends who loved him to the end." And following his death in 1888, the Chicago Times reported an interview with an unnamed Chicago man, who said, in the opinion of this gentleman, that no man in Missouri possessed greater courage or honesty than this heroic old man, David Whitmer. He then went on to say that no person had ever questioned David Whitmer's word to his knowledge about any other matter than finding the Book of Mormon. Whitmer was always a loser, never a gainer, by adhering to the faith of Joseph Smith. Why persons should question his word about the golden plates when they took it in relation to all other matters was to him a mystery. So I'm not saying that, because everyone highly respects him, he was respected and loved in his community because he was a man of integrity and successful, serving as mayor for a time, that therefore means that he is honest and reliable when it comes to his testimony of seeing the angel in the plates. But I would argue that all three of these men, particularly Oliver and David Whitmer, were highly respected by people in their community that knew them, knew that these were men of integrity, of sincerity, of honesty, and that they were very capable men as well, quite competent. Not just these gullible dupes that had a magical worldview. But of course, they still could have had this visionary mindset and been susceptible to having some sort of a vision/hallucination. But their characters are clear, and I think that this is quite strong evidence, particularly the fact that they never deny their testimonies that they weren't part of the conspiracy. Okay, let's go back to their video. So they're going to talk next about maybe some quotes that might call into question if they really did see the angel and the plates, and it seems more like vision or imagination. So they're going to start with Stephen Burnett, and I'm going to play a response that I have to some of these quotes in a previous video that I did.
To Brother Johnson, and this was from April 15th of 1838. Nemo, are you able to read this one?
Yeah, sure. When I came to hear Martin Harris state in public that he never saw the plates with his natural eyes, only in vision or imagination, neither Oliver nor David, and also that the 8 witnesses never saw them and hesitated to sign that instrument for that reason, but were persuaded to do it, the last pedestal gave way. In my view, our foundation was sapped and the entire superstructure fell in heap of ruins. I therefore 3 weeks since in the stone chapel renounced the Book of Mormon. After we were done speaking, M. Harris arose and said he was sorry for any man who rejected the Book of Mormon, for he knew it was true. He said he had hefted the plates repeatedly in a box with only a tablecloth or a handkerchief over them, but he never saw them, only as he saw a city through a mountain. And that said that he never should have told that the testimony of the 8 was false, if it had not been picked out of me, but should have let it pass as it was.
Okay, Julia or Mike, can one of you give some Kirtland, Ohio context for what is being discussed in this quote? Because as I understand it, there was an apostasy that happens in Kirtland, and some of it was potentially around Martin Harris. Some people believing that Martin Harris was equivocated a bit about his witness to the Book of Mormon. Do I got that right?
I think so.
I think you probably better. What year was this again? Was it 34?
This is 30. This is 37.
It says 38 on the slide.
38. So this is also the Kirtland Bank failure. So a lot of the members, a lot of the leaders of the church are leaving around the same time. I think this is when all the Whitmers left as well. And so I think just a lot of people are struggling. And then you can see that Martin's like, well, I shouldn't have said that about the 8 witnesses. I didn't really see the plates, just like you see a city through a mountain. It was in a vision only.
This is Kirtland, right? We're sure this is Kirtland, right?
I think that's where they were in 1838.
Okay, and there here it has Martin saying that he never saw the plates with his natural eyes, only in vision or imagination. And this is what Grant Palmer talks about in his book, An Insider's View of Mormon Origins, this distinction between the physical eyes and his spiritual eyes, or he uses other terms for it.
Second sight.
Do you guys remember the term Grant Palmer uses? Second sight. Second
sight's one of them.
Is another way he describes it. But this account clearly casts questions about whether Martin tried to de-physicalize his witness to the Book of Mormon. Right? I mean,
yeah. So the only thing I could think of is there are these meetings that they're having. I think they're in the Kirtland Temple because they are basically they've had enough of Joseph Smith, the bank failure, and so they're having this meeting to basically say, do we still believe in the Book of Mormon? We don't believe in Joseph Smith, but we still believe in the Book of Mormon. I believe that might be the context of these meetings. But yeah, and I know Dan Vogel talked about how like the phrase is "eye of faith," "eye of my mind." Those are very common revivalist languages about having those visions, and so these actually fit really well into that revivalist mindset of having these kind of visions that are like second sight, not your spiritual eye. So it fits in really well, and that's why a lot of times we look at it now, we're like, man, that's so weird. At the time, it wasn't as weird. It just takes away the physicality of the gold plates, which is really necessary for the entire Book of Mormon story to make any sense.
Okay. Did you, Julie, did you or Nemo have anything to add to that?
Not really.
I just want to, I think this is important. This is one of the reasons why I care so much about this whole topic. One more thing I want to show, and Wikipedia isn't always like true per se, obviously, but in the Wikipedia article, I'll just read what it says on Martin Harris. It says in 1838, Harris is said to have told, quote, he never saw the plates with his natural eyes, only in vision or imagination. And then it goes on to say a neighbor of Harris in Kirtland, Ohio, said that Harris, quote, never claimed to have seen the plates with his natural eyes, only spiritual vision. And then the reference is Reuben P. Harmon's statement. And I guess it says around 1885, but then again,
I quote both of those. And
then it has this Stephen Burnett to Lyman Johnson in 1838. So, that's significant in my mind. It's not an open and shut case, but to me, it's something everyone should know about.
Yeah, and I think it's important to be aware of that quote from Stephen Burnett. Now, I think the quotes where it talks about eye of faith, spiritual eye, seeing in vision, that those things are scriptural. They're scriptural terms. But there's other statements from Martin Harris a lot where he's very adamant about he knows he saw the angel and the plates he saw with these eyes, pointing to those eyes. So I don't view the spiritual eyes as this therefore means it was just in his mind, as you look collectively at their statements. And Stephen Burnett as well, he was very disillusioned. And I'm sure Martin used the terms such as seeing in vision, but I don't believe Martin would have said in imagination. I believe that this is what Stephen Burnett was inserting and adding in things like only this, only that. And also his source, this is third hand of what the 8 witnesses say as well, where all the 8 witnesses are quite consistent about seeing and handling. I do think this quote from David Whitmer is quite important, and they do bring this up later, but he says, of course we were in the spirit when we had the view, for no man can behold the face of an angel except in a spiritual view. But we were in the body also, and everything was as natural to us as it is at any time. Martin Harris, you say, called it being in vision. We read in the scriptures, Cornelius saw in a vision an angel of God. Daniel saw an angel in a vision. Also in other places it states that they saw an angel in the spirit. A bright light enveloped us where we were, that filled the woods at noonday. And there in a vision or in the spirit, we saw and heard just as it is stated in my spirit, in my testimony in the Book of Mormon. I feel like he's clarifying, like, this was natural, like we were in the body as well.
Richard Lord Anderson responds, Burnett uses only 4 times to ridicule the experience, showing his disbelief, not Martin's speech. So Burnett paraphrased Martin with the evident rationalizations of a skeptic. Study of Martin's interviews show how strongly he insisted that the sight of the angel and the plates was as real as the sight of the physical objects around him. In an 1870 letter, Martin Harris says, I do say that the angel did show to me the plates containing the Book of Mormon. The witnesses left us no evidence that they doubted the reality of what they experienced, supernaturally as well as physically and tangibly. Terrell Givens compared it to Paul's vision. Whether in the body or out of the body, I can't tell. But using the term spiritual eyes doesn't undermine the reality of what he saw. Martin emphatically asserts until the day of his death the actuality of the angel who came down from heaven and who brought and laid the plates before our eyes that we beheld and saw, while also at times stating that he saw in a spiritual vision. So we're relying on if Martin Harris was accurately recorded by Stephen Burnett. And it's also understanding that quote with other statements from Martin Harris, where he makes it very emphatic and clear that he saw the angel and he saw the plates. But it might call into question, was this a natural, like physical experience, or was this just a spiritual vision? Did they just imagine it, or was it second sight? David Whitmer has to say this. He rejected that either it was spiritual or natural by saying that he saw by both spiritual and natural means. The superb interview of David Whitmer's own words on this point, he explained that he saw the plates with his natural eyes, but he had to be prepared for it, that he and the other witnesses were overshadowed by the power of God and a halo of brightness indescribable. A letter written to Anthony Metcalfe in 1887, David Whitmer has this to say about spiritual eyes and seeing in vision. In regards to my testimony to the visitation of the angel who declared to us, their witness, that the Book of Mormon is true, I have this to say, of course we were in the spirit when we have the view. For no man can behold the face of an angel except in a spiritual view. But we are in the body also, and everything was as natural to us as it is at any time. Martin Harris, you say, called it being in vision. We read in the scriptures, Cornelius saw in a vision an angel of God. Daniel saw an angel in a vision. So according to Whitmer, that they were in the spirit, that it was a visionary experience, but they were in the body also, and that everything was as natural around them. And that using the word vision doesn't mean it wasn't real.
Historian and Professor Stephen Harper said of Stephen Burnett's statement, one is struck by the 3 instances of in Burnett's statement. He built his interpretation of the witnesses on hypotheticals. If the witnesses never saw the plates as he believed Martin Harris had said, and if Joseph never saw them, they were only visionary. After listening to Burnett expound that rationale, Martin Harris asserted unequivocally in contrast that the plates were real. As Burnett reported, Harris said, he had hefted the plates repeatedly in a box, with only a tablecloth or a handkerchief over them. Harris did not wish to be understood as Burnett understood him, because there's so many other times where Martin Harris talks about seeing the plates, the angel showing him the plates. So I believe this is a conflation of the plates being covered with a cloth when he is scribe. And while we know Martin Harris did use the terms like vision to describe his experience, he wouldn't have described it as imagination or not really seeing the plates. That's Burnett's interpretation. This hearsay accounts like Burnett's have been useful to others for building a believable alternative to the straightforward statements of the witnesses. Grant Palmer wrote of his own youthful faith being undermined by later doubts. His chapter in the Book of Mormon Witnesses expresses his doubts about the authenticity of accounts by the witnesses in the Book of Mormon, and instead draws on hearsay accounts, where he finds some threads that enable him to conclude that the witnesses thought they had experienced the plates, but had not. This explanation is appealing to some because it does not completely dismiss the compelling testimonies of the Book of Mormon witnesses, even as it characterizes them as unreal. And I'm going to read through a lot of the witnesses' statements later. But Stephen Burnett, it's a source, it's a data point. It's definitely probably the best one that critics would point to. If Martin Harris did say this, then it seems quite troubling. But when it comes to the 8 witnesses, I think it's important to read what the 8 witnesses have to say about their experience.
Non-Mormon's going to look at us all and say, you're all like, this is like hobbits and dwarves and elves. Like you're all trying to take serious this account that strains all credibility from the start. In the material world, angels don't deliver golden plates to humans.
Yeah.
But here we are trying to strain like, okay, wait, why did he hide it? And when did he see it? And did Martin mean it when he said it was his physical eyes or not? Like, it's kind of interesting that we're even taking this seriously, honestly.
And of course, people who are secular, who do not believe in God, angels, that these sorts of things can happen, would just see this as, this is ridiculous, this is absurd, angels don't come and visit people. But if you're somebody who is open to the divine, to God, to angels, to the supernatural, then I feel like you just can't dismiss at hand, particularly as we read a lot of their statements at the end of this video. I can't help but believe that these men, they sincerely believe and know what they experience. They're very consistent about it. And I feel like it needs to be taken seriously.
So this is a book called Gleanings, by the way, and it was published in 1842. Do we want to read this whole thing?
Yeah,
we still have time?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is John A. Clark. He says, to know how much this testimony is worth, I will state one fact. A gentleman in Palmyra, bred to the law, a professor of religion, and undoubted veracity, told me that on one occasion he appealed to Harris and asked him directly, did you see those plates? Harris replied, he did. Did you see the plates and the engravings on them with your bodily eyes? Which is an interesting way of asking if it was a physical thing. Harris replied, yes, I saw them with my eyes. They were shown it to me by the power of God and not of man. But then the person's asking, but did you see them with your natural, your bodily eyes, just as you see this pencil case in my hand? Now say no or yes to this. Harris replied, why, I do not see them as I do that pencil case, or I did not see them, why I did not see them as I do that pencil case, yet I saw them with the eye of faith. I saw them just as distinctly as I see anything around me, though at the time they were covered with a cloth.
Backpedaling 101.
So he saw him through a cloth?
That's what this account is saying. This is what I say, 1840 was when this was published.
Okay, and I've got my response to the John Clark one, that this is coming third hand from a gentleman in Palmyra as well, who John Clark is interviewing. And it seems to be a conflation because none of the witnesses, when they talk about their experience, their vision of the angel of the plates, talk about the plates being covered in a cloth. That would have been when Martin Harris was scribe.
Addresses in response to Clark's statements that this is a third-hand statement, not coming from Clark's interactions with Harris first-hand, but from a gentleman in Palmyra. There could be a conflation of Harris seeing the plates as you see a city through a mountain, while the plates were covered when Martin was scribe and the plates were covered in the cloth. When we look at the other statements from Martin Harris, he's very clear when he talks about seeing the angel. As sure as you see my hand, I saw the angel in the plates. Perhaps this is being quoted when he was scribe. And also, if something's third hand, it means it's a little bit less reliable than it's coming first hand. They also say when Martin Harris said that he had seen the angel in the plates with his spiritual eyes or with an eye of faith, he may have simply been employing some scriptural language that he was familiar with. Such statements do not mean that the angel in the plates were imaginary, hallucinatory, or just an inner mental image. The earliest accounts of Martin Harris's testimony makes the literal nature of the experience unmistakable. And spiritual eyes is also a scriptural term. For example, Moses talked about seeing God with his spiritual eyes, but not his natural eyes. And elsewhere, Martin has emphasized seeing with natural eyes. And in D&C, I believe it's 17, it talks about the witnesses seeing with the eye of faith.
So I see this as not a credible quote. This is quite unreliable. And there's also so many other statements from Martin Harris, which we will read, where he talks about, as sure as you see the sun in the sky, I saw the plates. Do you see this hand with your eyes? Are your eyes playing a trick? No, as sure as you see my hand, I saw the plates. Do you see that chopping block? As sure as I see that chopping block, I saw the plates. He's very emphatic in so many other statements that he really did see. And that's why I think we should be cautious, especially if we're focusing on a third-hand account, to say, well, that's what Martin Harris believed he experienced.
$101.
So he saw him through a cloth?
That's what this account is saying. And this is what I say, 1840 was when this was published. So,
Interesting.
yeah, I saw them, but in a spiritual sense, and they were covered with cloth. So,
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, let's go to the next one.
John, do you want to read this one?
Yeah, so this is Martin Harris interview with Anthony Metcalfe sometime in the early 1870s. So this is Martin Harris himself. All right, Martin Harris, who was one of the 3 witnesses to the Book of Mormon, was living in Smithfield, Cache Valley, or close to where I used to live in North Logan, with his son Martin. I called to see him, and he gave me his history from his youth up. This occurred in the winter of 1875 to 76, which makes those dates wrong above. Following is the history as related to me, including all his connections with Joseph Smith, the pretended prophet and the founder of the Mormon Church. He told me all about the translating of the Book of Mormon and said he had given $5,000 towards this publication. He said, quote, so this is Martin, I never saw the golden plates, only in a visionary or entranced state. I wrote a great deal of the Book of Mormon myself, except I got lost, as Joseph Smith translated or spelled the words out in English. Sometimes the plates would be on a table in the room in which Smith did the translating, covered over with a cloth. I was told by Joseph Smith that God would strike him dead if he attempted to look at them. Now that's Martin saying that, and I believed it, of course, through Anthony Metcalfe. So I was told by Joseph Smith that God would strike him dead if he attempted to look at it, and I believed it. When the time came for the 3 witnesses to see the golden plates, Joseph Smith, myself, David Whitmer, Oliver Cowdery went into the woods to pray. When they had all engaged in prayer, they failed at that time to see the plates. So weirdly, Martin Harris's righteousness affected Joseph, Oliver, and David's experience, but I continue. They all believed it was because I was not good enough, or in other words, not sufficiently sanctified. Again, that's treasure digging vibes about not killing the chicken properly, but I digress. Back to Martin. I withdrew. As soon as I'd gone away, the 3 others saw the angel and the plates. In about 3 days, I went into the woods to pray that I might see the plates. While praying, I passed into a state of entrancement, and in that state, I saw the angel and the plates. Now, that's different from the church's version of what happened with Martin. Right?
Isn't that just smack of the kid that got left out? Like, he goes and all his friends get to see the thing, and then so he a couple of days later then claims that he saw it too because he doesn't want to be left out. Like, that's the vibe I get from that.
Yeah. But I just wanted to point out with the timeline. So Anthony Metcalfe had this interview with him in 74, 75, whatever it says on the slide. But his book he didn't publish this until 88, if you look at the other side. So yeah, he's reflecting about the winter events. Anyway, so I just wanted to clarify that.
Plates. Jim Bennett, in the CS letter responds to 2 of the quotes from the early Mormon documents. He says that these 2 statements are part of a single quote attributed to Martin Harris after his death by Anthony Metcalfe. No credible historian in or out of the church accepts these hearsay slanders as reliable, and also that describing a visit from an angel as a vision does not preclude that it was a literal experience.
So I think this is published after Martin Harris's death. Although as I read through that statement, I don't see a lot of it as factually wrong, because I think there's a couple of statements that I've seen from David Whitmer and Martin Harris talk about him seeing it 3 days after, but then there's other accounts that make it seem like he saw it just after. So I don't know what to make about that, because there is a couple of accounts that support that. So I don't know if Martin Harris then saw it on a different day for the first 2 witnesses. But it seems like he's just emphasizing that Martin Harris saw it in a visionary state, or he's using the language of entranced state. And again, I think this is someone who is just emphasizing the visionary aspect to it, probably as a way to make it seem like it's not as real. Like it's not real. But using the language of vision doesn't take away from it being real.
But yeah, so he's saying one thing, of course he's saying, Martin Harris in this account, he's saying that 3 days later, he goes into the woods and has his experience. Whereas in the official history of the church, Joseph's version, it was just the same afternoon. He just goes, they have their experience, and then he goes off and finds him praying. And then he with Martin had that vision again.
And on the one hand, he's old and it's many years later, and sometimes people's memory gets foggy. Right. On the other hand, when you're literally seeing angels in golden plates, you think you kind of remember when that happens. Mike,
right.
You have any thoughts on this?
And again, there's precedent for people not quite remembering the exact nature of very, very important heavenly visitations. Let's just look at Joseph Smith and his multiple accounts of the first vision.
Yeah. We got a couple more. Let's go ahead and get to them. What's the next one, Julia?
Okay, so this is John H. Gilbert. This is in his memorandum, and it was published on September 8th of 1892. So this is a later source. But he says, Martin was in the office when I finished setting up the testimony of the 3 witnesses, Harris, Cowdery, and Whitmer. I said to him, Martin, did you see those plates with your naked eyes? Martin looked down for an instant, raised his eyes up, and said, no, I saw them with his spiritual eye.
Okay. John, can I get your best impression of that? Like a look down and then a look up? Like...
It's like, no, I saw them with a spiritual eye.
Boom. That's how you sell it. Right there.
And I mean, that is super late. I mean, that would be the criticism of that quote. It's super late.
But
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, but it's confirming these other ones that we've said. So,
And do we know John H. Gilbert's position with the church? Was he a hater? Was he?
I don't know.
Like I was saying earlier, it kind of almost doesn't matter what his position was. If this just corroborates all the other stuff we know,
Yeah.
then it kind of stands on its own, really.
Okay. Yeah.
So that was some
And
fun
again, on the one hand, Mike, to your point, if it's all visionary, then it's all possible if you believe in visions. On the other hand, the whole point of the 3 and the 8 witnesses is to say that it wasn't visionary, but they saw with their own eyes and touched with their own hands. So it can't be both ways, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
Well, what's interesting is that there's so many other statements that we're going to read from the witnesses that talk about seeing with their eyes, hearing with their ears, that it was real to them. But then they also use the language of vision, and I don't think it has to be either. It's either a vision or it's a visitation, and if it's not, it's either a vision or it's a visitation. Similar to like Paul's experience on the road to Damascus, or when the angel came and appeared to Mary. But see, it's interesting because elsewhere, this comes from Fair, that Martin elsewhere emphasizes that the vision was also with his natural eye to enable them to testify of it to the world. In 1875, Martin said, "The prophet Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer and myself went into a little grove to obtain a promise that we should behold it with our eyes," and he crossed out eyes, natural eyes, that we could testify of it. Harris did not then see spiritual eye and natural eye as mutually exclusive. Both describe something about the witness's experience. And if you look here, like this is scriptural language, like seeing with the eye of faith. That's in Ether 12, about people being able to see Christ. And it's noticed that people who have exceedingly strong faith can see things within the veil, even though they see things in the spiritual realm with their eyes. It is described as beholding things with an eye of faith. And similar in Moses 1:11, it talks about when Moses sees God, that mine own eyes have beheld God, but not my natural, but my spiritual eyes. My natural eyes could not have beheld, for I would have withered and died in his presence, but his glory was upon me, and I beheld his face. Whitmer explained that he saw the plates with his natural eyes, but he had to be prepared for it, that he and the other witnesses were overshadowed by the power of God, almost like transfigured, in order to behold this heavenly visionary experience. Continue.
The church never taught us about these various versions of what Martin did or didn't see. It was meticulously and thoughtfully and intentionally hid from all of us, which should also be its own witness, so to speak. Let's go ahead and go to the last slide with Martin Harris, Julie.
Okay, if you want to go there, you could say that the church intentionally hid, never talked about these accounts. And I think that there has been things in the past where the church hasn't been fully transparent about. But on the subject of the witnesses, the church hasn't also, I didn't learn about all of the other positive statements, which we're going to read at the end of the witnesses, until I really dived into it. So I feel like these accounts and these sources and these statements of the witnesses, that this is more of a historical scholarly approach. And also, if you're going to be critical of the church, all of the statements that I'm going to read at the end of the video, critics, I have not heard from critics acknowledge, perhaps except for Dan Vogel with his early Mormon documents. I didn't learn it from Mormon Think or Grant Palmer or any other critical resources. The quotes I'm going to read at the end of Oliver Cowdery, Martin Harris, or David Whitmer. Now, in credit to them in this video, they do read a couple of them, so I do credit them for that. But I think it's quite unfair because you could make the same argument that critics have intentionally omitted or hidden to be misleading a lot of the 95% of the statements of the witnesses and focusing just on the 5%.
Okay, so this one you referenced before. This is Reuben P. Harmon, and it was published in this newspaper called Naked Truths About Mormonism in 1888. And he says, "I was well acquainted with Martin Harris, who was often at my house for days at a time. I have questioned him much about the plates from which the Book of Mormon purports to have been translated. He never claimed to have seen them with his natural eyes, only spiritual vision."
So Elder OP, Awesome Pratt, it says, "Do you remember what time you saw the plates?" David Whitmer responds, "It was in June 1829, the latter part of the month, and the 8 witnesses saw them, I think, the next day or the day after, i.e."
What I'm also noticing is that earlier when we talked about the first revelation that Joseph was giving in June, where he's like, "Oh yeah, you'll witness the Urim and Thummim, the Liahona, the Sword of Laban." David Whitmer is even adding more items. He's saying the brass plates, the plates of the secret combinations, and things like that. So there's even more items, or even this table. Nobody else describes this table except David Whitmer.
All right. Well, let's keep rolling. This is fascinating, Julia.
Yeah. Okay, so this next one is David Whitmer's interview with John Murphy. And so this one I thought was really interesting. So in an 1880 interview with John Murphy, David Whitmer was asked about what the angel looked like. David Whitmer responded, "It had no appearance or shape." Murphy says, "Then you saw nothing nor heard nothing?" Whitmer says, "Nothing in the way you understand it." Murphy then says, How then could you have borne testimony that you saw and heard an angel?" Whitmer, have you never had impressions? Murphy, then you had impressions as the Quaker when the spirit moves, or as a good Methodist and giving a happy experience, a feeling? Whitmer, just so.
Merely a feeling.
Yeah, so he's saying that the angel had no appearance or shape, and that it was just an impression.
But 50 years earlier, he was saying that he saw an angel stood there,
right,
in the midst of light.
And I mean, traditionally, with historians, the earliest account is usually best, is assumed to be best. And I'm just wondering if we can think that way about these witnesses, because when they were members of the church, they were sort of under Joseph Smith's control and influence, and they would have been more susceptible to his pressure and his power. And I'm just wondering if we can trust the witnesses more while they were under Joseph Smith's power, or more once they had left the church and left Joseph's orbit.
So what are you saying, like, later sources is when they're actually then kind of working out for themselves what really happened?
Able to be more honest, basically, without worrying about repercussions.
So in so many other accounts, David Whitmer refers to the angel appearing wearing, white clothing, that there's a brilliant light. This seems to be more of an anomaly statement. I don't know how accurate this is of what David Whitmer reported, but the comments they're making about that we should trust their later statements more than their early statements because they aren't under the control of Joseph Smith, I think is very interesting, because we're going to read through a lot of those later statements from the witnesses as well, and what they still have to say about the experience.
All right, well, let's keep rolling. This is fascinating, Julia.
Yeah. Okay, so this next one is David Whitmer's interview with John Murphy. And so this one I thought was really interesting. So in an 1880 interview, the angel had no...
If we can trust the witnesses more...
...scheme, being a fact which has resulted in so much woe to many, and as he seems to be nearly 80 years old, he ought not to delay. So this is former testimony. The editor of the Hamilton newspaper, John Murphy, stated, my impression, which I think to be as good as his or his angel, is that he ought to reconsider and contradict his former testimony to a delusion, or perhaps a cunning scheme, being a fact which has resulted in so much woe to many, and as he seems to be nearly 80 years old, he ought not to delay. So this is so the interview was published in this newspaper, and John Murphy's giving his final his conclusion of his speech to these people, to the editor, and so he says David Whitmer should just recant his testimony. He should just reconsider, and then later this next slide, David Whitmer responds to him publicly, and that's one of the reasons why he published his pamphlet. I can't remember the name of it this second. An address to all believers in Christ. And so we'll read his response. But so he just shares. So John Murphy shares the interview, and then he's like, it sounds to me like he didn't really see the angel, so he should just reconsider. He should contradict his former testimony, and he should do it fast because he's an old man and he's going to die soon. So so that's important context for this next slide.
Okay, keep going.
Yeah. Okay. So Mike, do you want to read this one? The rebuttal?
Yep. So this is on March 1881. David Whitmer responds to John Murphy's claims. He says, it having been represented by one John Murphy of Polo, Caldwell County, Missouri, that I, in a conversation with him last summer, denied my testimony as one of the 3 witnesses to the Book of Mormon, to the end, therefore, that he may understand me now, if he did not then, and that the world may know the truth, I wish now, standing as it were, in the very sunset of life, and in the fear of God, once for all, to make this public statement, that I have never at any time denied that testimony or any part thereof, which has so long since been published with that book, as one of the 3 witnesses. Those that know me best well know that I have always adhered to that testimony, and that no man may be misled or doubt my present views in regard to the same. I do again affirm the truth of all of my statements, as then made and published. He that hath an ear to hear, let him hear. It was no delusion. What is written, and he that readeth, let him understand.
Sorry, so Julia, what do you want us to take from that?
So a lot of people point to this one. They're like, see, he never denied his testimony. And so the thing that John Murphy wasn't pointing out that he was denying his testimony, which I think is really interesting. So the word delusion means that it's a falsehood. So I think David Whitmer, or it sounds like these witnesses actually saw what they said they saw, but in a visionary state. And so he was trying to say, David Whitmer says, they weren't really there. It wasn't, what did he say? It wasn't in a form. It had no appearance or shape, and it was just an impression. And then, so I think what David Whitmer is responding to is this idea that he gives that John Murphy says, he should just reconsider pulling his testimony or recanting it because he didn't actually see the angel. And then David Whitmer's reiterating, yes, I did see him. But I think they're just misunderstanding each other. What were your guys' thoughts when you're...
Okay, yeah, I get her point, because John Murphy isn't saying that David Whitmer denied his testimony. He's saying that it sounded more like a delusion, and that he thinks David Whitmer should deny his testimony because he's saying that the angel had no sort of appearance or shape. Again, the other accounts I have from David Whitmer, he doesn't go deep into the description of the angel like what Joseph Smith did, for example, when Angel Moroni first visited him. But it seems like he is very defensive and feels misrepresented, to respond to that interview from John Whitmer.
I love his work, and he's published a lot of these early Mormon documents. He's got, I think, 5 volumes. Anyway, he kind of gives some commentary about this interview. He pointed out that, as the editor of the Kingston Times subsequently noted, quote, "The studious reader will fail to see wherein Mr. Murphy alleges that Elder Whitmer denies being a witness." So I pointed out earlier where John Murphy didn't say he denied his testimony. He's just saying we need to see it. In my head, it's like we need to see it as a different understanding. Like he saw what he says he saw, but it wasn't a physical thing.
Whereas David Whitmer built up a straw man and accused him of saying that he did something and then got to defend that.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yes, very straw man.
Interesting. Okay.
Okay, so this next one is David Whitmer's interview with Joseph Smith III, and this happened in 1884. Check this one in there. So this one isn't contradictory to the story, but what I want to point out also is I feel like this is a straw man thing again, because he says, "I saw with these eyes, and then I heard with my ears." So no one's saying that he didn't. Like, but what we're saying and what he seems to be implying with all these other accounts is that it was not an actual physical.
How are you implying it there? I didn't see that.
Well, not here, but in these other ones.
Okay.
It's like right here he's saying I saw with my eyes, it was no hallucination, but like you can still have hallucinations and see with your eyes and hear with your ears.
Yeah, she's right. You can still have hallucinations. I'm not. People can have hallucinations. You can't acknowledge the possibility of it being a hallucination. I think it's definitely more improbable when all three people having a mass hallucination.
And critics would also say with the three witnesses, maybe they just had a mass hallucinatory visionary experience. Fair states that only 3% of the population are susceptible to visual hallucinations and 9% audible hallucinations. The witnesses both claim to both see the angel in the plates and to hear the voice of God. These statistics reduce the likelihood that all three men would hallucinate the same thing and never deny it until the day they died. And Vogel would believe that all three of them would have had sort of experiences that would have made them more susceptible, being believers, open, having more of a visionary mindset. Still, the odds of all three of them having a mass hallucination of seeing the angel and the plate, never denying it even after leaving the church. And on top of this as well, the Book of Mormon prophesies that three witnesses will see the plates in the Book of Ether by the power of God, as well in section 17 of the Doctrine and Covenants, which is a pretty amazing and very overconfident thing for Joseph Smith to prophesy and then pull off, and that they all happen to hallucinate the same vision and never deny it and reaffirm it until the day they die. For Joseph Smith to have pulled off a mass hallucination, whether he influenced it or it was self-induced by the three witnesses, as well as making his own set of metal plates to dupe the 8 witnesses, that's pretty amazing if he was able to pull that off.
That's definitely lower on the percentage scale of likelihood. But people can see and hear and think it's real, but it still could be a hallucination. But as David Whitmer refers to in this account, and many others that we're going to read from Oliver Martin and David Whitmer at the end, they refer often to seeing with their eyes and hearing with their ears, even if in other times they refer to it being a vision.
This is what like it's just a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm seeing a lot of defensiveness in this.
Yeah.
I'm
Right.
seeing a lot of like it's because essentially someone's accused him of being tricked or having a hallucination, and he wants to put that idea to bed. Because, like we were talking about earlier, it's like no, that's not what happened to me. But then if you were to dig deeper into it, the spiritualized thing would probably come out again.
Right.
As
I think,
yeah.
I was going to say, I think with the concept of hallucinations and things like that are sort of like seen as negative, like, oh, this is from the devil, but he sees this as a very spiritual experience. And so I don't think he would have ever used those words to describe it, nor have they. They say it's in a visionary state or things like that are more scriptural or more holy words, I guess.
Well, yeah, hallucination implies that your brain's tricking you essentially into seeing something.
Right.
There.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. And it's also good. We don't mind sharing affirming corroborative evidence on this podcast. We're trying to be balanced. And so we're trying to show lots of different accounts. So that's good, Julia. All right.
Okay, so this next one is from a book called it's Public Discussions of the Issues Between the Reorganized Church and the Church of Christ. So none of these are the mainstream church. These are different churches. And the authors are Kelly and Braden. And this was published in 1884. And this is just giving like kind of an overview of their opinion of the statements. Mike, are you able to read this one? Just you can start.
Yeah.
We are now ready.
Yeah, so it says, we are now ready for the 8 witnesses. Their testimony is worthless. They testify that they saw and handled certain plates that Joe showed them, that the plates had on them characters of ancient workmanship and were of ancient and curious workmanship, that they saw as many plates as Smith had translated. How did they know that he had translated the plates before them? How did they know that Joe had translated any plates? That the plates had been given to him by an angel? That the Book of Mormon was a translation of the plates before them or of any plates? The only thing that they could testify that was that Joe had showed them certain plates. All the rest they could not know and lied when they said they did not know, and lied when they said they did know. Another fatal objection to the testimony of both the 3 witnesses and of the 8 is that they are all of the gang of low villainous followers of Smith and interested in the fraud. The 13 are as follows: Imposter Joe, author of the fraud; Old Joe, his father, a notorious drunkard, liar, and thief; Hiram Smith, his brother, afterwards a leader in Mormonism; Samuel H. Smith, I think, another old Mr. Whitmer, David Whitmer, Christian Whitmer, Peter Whitmer, John Whitmer, Oliver Cowdery, Hiram Page, brother-in-law of the Whitmers, Martin Harris, old Mrs. Whitmer, and Emma Smith, Joe's wife, 6 Whitmers, one member of the family, 4 Smiths, Oliver Cowdery, and Martin Harris.
I mean, that's pretty antagonistic, huh?
Yeah, wow.
So I think even as an active member of the church, I remember processing like seeing gold plates doesn't mean that you know that the translation is correct. And that's what this book is trying to point out. Like seeing the plates, it doesn't help Joseph's case.
Sure. And when it comes to the 8 witnesses as well, even when John Whitmer is most disillusioned, I mentioned earlier, and Theodore Turley asks him, like, if you're one of the witnesses of the gold plates, how can you then be denying that Joseph Smith is a prophet? And he says, well, yeah, he showed me the plates, but there's no way that I can determine whether the characters are genuine or not, or the translation is correct. So I think they're making a fair point that the witnesses, I believe, have their own spirit. The 8 witnesses have their own spiritual testimony of the Book of Mormon, but they were just shown the gold plates and the engravings and characters on them. So they themselves could not verify the translation, compared to the 3 witnesses who were shown the gold plates, shown it by an angel, but they actually heard the voice of God saying that the translation was correct. But yeah, quite an antagonistic quote. But it was actually quite accurate about who the witnesses were and what they claimed.
And so I just thought that was an important.
And this almost strikes me as like they're describing the beginning of what is a trope in Mormonism to this day, saying you know things that you can't actually know. We say, I know the church is true. You can't know that. You can believe that, and that's fine. That can be your belief. But using the word know to ascribe certainty to a position that's held purely in belief because you don't actually have any evidence, so therefore you can't know. That we see that language there, and that's something that's happening today in testimony meetings all around the world.
I actually agree with Nemo there. I think we often say we know things a lot in the church because of our own spiritual convictions or experiences, feeling like we've received answers to prayer or manifestation from the Spirit. But I actually agree. I think we often use the language of knowing too much. I think in the case of the 3 witnesses, if they really did see what they experienced, then they could testify to knowing. But often I think members of the church say they know things without any doubt, when really it's more a matter of belief based upon certain experiences.
Yep.
So in response to a question by Anthony Metcalfe, Whitmer attempted to clarify the spiritual versus natural viewing of the plates. John, do you want to go ahead and read this one?
Yeah. Quote, in regards to my testimony to the visitation of the angel who declared to us 3 witnesses that the Book of Mormon is true, I have this to say. Of course we were in the spirit when we had the view. For no man can behold the face of an angel except in a spiritual view. Unless you're Saul on the road to Damascus or Alma the Younger.
Joseph Smith.
But I continue. But we were in the body also, and everything was, in other words, they were alive. Sorry, and I'm editorializing. And everything was as natural to us as it is at any time. Okay. Martin Harris, you say, called it, quote, being in vision. So he's acknowledging, I think that's important. He's acknowledging that Martin diverged. I'm sorry, I'm probably stealing your thunder, Julia.
Oh, no, you're fine.
But he's acknowledging that Martin diverged in his story.
I don't think Martin diverged. I think just using the language of vision is consistent with their experience. And I think he's clarifying that, yeah, it was a visionary experience. They were in the spirit, but they were also in the body also, that it's not one or the other.
As a witness. So we have to take that seriously. Martin Harris, you say, called it, quote, being in a vision, close quote. We read in the scriptures, Cornelius saw in a vision an angel of God. He's using the word vision. Daniel saw an angel in a vision. Also in other places, it states they saw an angel in the spirit. A bright light enveloped us where we were that filled at noonday. And there in a vision or in the spirit, we saw and heard just as it is stated in my testimony in the Book of Mormon. I am now past 82 years old, and I have a brother, J.J. Snyder, to do my writing for me at my dictation, signed David Whitmer. Okay, that's sounding very much like spiritualized vision language to me. Mike, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it is. It's kind of like saying, yeah, it wasn't physical, but it also was real. And you get to a point where it's like, if you want to do that, then every other person who's had a vision of all sorts of other religions, whether it's a vision of Muhammad or a vision of, ancient religions, you got to be like, well, then theirs is true too. And no one in Mormonism is going to do that because, of course, Mormonism has, is the one true church. And so this is where it falls apart. And that's why, I keep saying, like, to a certain extent, once you realize this isn't a physical thing, and even if it was, you have the Book of Mormon as your evidence. But yeah, this is just, it's screaming to everybody out there who's paying attention to the wording. I guess I would call these weasel words, that he's saying, yeah, this is spiritual. I'm just going to try to frame it differently.
I don't see it as that these are weasel words. I see it as he is trying to clarify the experience, that even though they talk about it as a visionary experience, they were still in the body. It was still natural. It was still the angel appearing to them. Like, look, I've not had a vision, so I don't know what it would be like, how to explain or characterize it. But I personally would find it more strange if they said there was no visionary component, no glorious, brilliant light. that there wasn't some transfiguration if it was just like an angel, but he looked like a normal guy that came and showed the plates. And I think using the terms vision is them trying to make it sound more scriptural.
We can't look at the 5% because all of this is gelling. But what you're seeing is that 5% or the 10% is when they're getting pushback, and when they're getting pushback, the story changes. When they're getting pushback, they have to make those clarifications, and that's why the 5 to 10%, whatever percent it is so damaging to the rest, because the rest of it.
I always find it weird that you would think the 3 witnesses, being the most important, they would like be the ones that did the most. They see the engravings, they see the plates as a whole, and then you would think they would also handle them. But it's interesting, and maybe this will come up, but it's interesting that the 8 witnesses hefted the plates. I think that's the word they use. They describe hefting them, but they don't see them. And I think that points back to what Mike was saying earlier about them not passing visual inspection, because these guys saw things in a vision, but never connected that to their physical sense of touch. The 8 witnesses used their physical sense of touch, but never saw. And those 2 things have been compartmentalized, almost as though they, what I'm trying to say, but never saw. And those 2 things have been compartmentalized, almost as though they, what I'm trying to say.
So Neil was trying to say that it's interesting because you got 3 witnesses who claimed to see the plates, but they didn't handle them. Although I think the accounts from Oliver and Martin talk about handling the plates as well. It's likely when they were scribes, but not during the vision of the angel and the plates. But the 8 witnesses, critics try to argue that the 8 witnesses didn't actually see the plates or see the engravings according to the official testimony, but they just handled and hefted them with a cloth and saw them through the cloth. And we'll address this probably more in the next episode. But I'm just going to read a few accounts where they talk about seeing and handling the plates, which seems to be in a natural way consistent with their testimony. In an interview that John Whitmer had in 1878, he's asked, "Did you see them covered with a cloth?" He replies, "No, he handed them uncovered into our hands, and we turned the leaves sufficient to satisfy us." In a letter to Myron Bond in 1878, old Father Whitmer told me the last winter with tears in his eyes that he knew as well as he knew that he had an existence, that Joseph translated the ancient writing which was upon the plates, which he saw and handled, and which is one of his scribes he helped to copy as the words fell from Joseph's lips by supernatural or almighty power. Aaron Page talked about him being rejoicing exceedingly in having been privileged to see the plates. John Whitmer in 1836 in the Latter-day Saints Messenger and Advocate, "I have no hesitancy, but with all confidence have signed my name to it as such. Hope that my patrons will indulge me in speaking freely on this subject as I am about leaving the editorial department. I desire to testify to all that will come to the knowledge of this address, that I have most assuredly seen the plates from whence the Book of Mormon is translated, and that I have handled these plates, and know of a surety that Joseph Smith Jr. has translated the Book of Mormon by the gift and power of God." So he talks about most assuredly seeing and handling. John C. Whitmer testified to Elder Andrew Jensen that my father, Jacob Whitmer, was always faithful and true to his testimony in the Book of Mormon. Hiram Smith talked about the Book of Mormon, which he is one of the witnesses, and he said he had but 2 hands and 2 eyes. He said he had seen the plates with his eyes and handled them with his hands. And Mary Fielding Smith also testified that her husband Hiram has seen and handled the plates. And Hiram's final testimony, he said, "However, I thank God that I felt a determination to die rather than deny the things which my eyes had seen and which my hands had handled and which I had borne testimony to." So that was just a few statements where the 8 witnesses talk about seeing and handling the plates, not just handling. Back to the video.
David Whitmer had so in his pamphlet, so he publishes it in response to many things, and he exposes a lot of different things like we talked about, like the priesthood restoration not being like retroactively being fitted in. And then he had the perfect opportunity in this pamphlet to give his own personal recollection of seeing the gold plates. However, he doesn't do this. Instead, he copied both witness statements as they stood in the Book of Mormon, and this is on page 13 of his pamphlet. And in another place, he quotes a Richmond, Missouri newspaper that states, quote, "There is no doubt that Mr. Whitmer, who was one of the 3 witnesses of the authenticity of the golden plates, from which he asserts that Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon, is firmly convinced of its divine origin." And so I just think that's super interesting. So he never at any point in his own publication, he never gives his own account of what happened that day. He just copy and paste, copy and paste.
And also this misnomer that keeps cropping up, and now I can't unsee it, where they talk about him being a witness of the authenticity of the gold plates, which he just isn't. They never were. They were witnesses perhaps of the existence of such plates, but none of them are witnesses to the correctness of Joseph Smith's translation of what was on this object, if that object existed.
Well, they are testifying that they heard the voice of God telling them that the translation was correct. So I feel like if they really did experience and they heard the voice of God telling them, an angel showing them the voice of God telling them that the translation is correct, then I think they probably could say that they know. And I think Mike makes a comment here where he sort of agrees with my reasoning.
Right.
And I think actually that's one of those things that once you see, you kind of can't unsee.
Mike, what do you make? We talked about this quite a bit in one of our past episodes. Mike, what do you make of him not mentioning that really crucial event in his own pamphlet?
I think he knows better. I mean, I think that's the whole point. If you retell the story now, he knows all anyone's going to focus on what the differences are. So that's my guess as to why. And I think to Nemo's point, yeah, they aren't witnesses to the authenticity of the plates, but that's really more of like what we think now that we're no longer believers in the church. I think to them, if you see plates in a vision and you believe God is speaking to you saying it's translated correctly, then in their minds, they are witnesses to the authenticity. So I don't think they're lying or anything when they say that, but I think it's that matter of perspective. Like, do you believe that they're having witnesses of these plates that we've talked about are just they're non-starters as far as being plausible. But yeah, I just think it's like when you go to like a big company today and you ask them for a comment on something, like on a statement they make, and they're like, we stand by our statement. I think that's kind of his point, is like, I'm not going to open myself up to people doing textual analysis to see where I'm changing my story now.
Interesting. And Julia, you've got a second slide on this, right?
My pushback to that is, like, I'm not troubled if David Whitmer copied a previous statement because he felt like, I don't need to keep repeating myself. Here's the statement, and it still stands true. And David is the witness who has interviewed the most. We're going to read, I've accumulated nearly 40 statements. Richard Anderson says there's about 70. So if that was his reasoning, that I don't want to rewrite my own statement in case I'm found a contradiction, then why would you agree to be interviewed like 70 times? So I don't fully agree with that reasoning that they're giving.
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. So without expanding on his experience in this simple pamphlet, the same pamphlet, excuse me, David Whitmer proclaimed the following: "It is recorded in the American Encyclopedia, the Encyclopedia Britannica, that I, David Whitmer, have denied my testimony as one of the 3 witnesses of the divinity of the Book of Mormon, and that the other 2 witnesses, Oliver Cowdery and Martin Harris, deny their testimony of that book. I will say once more to all mankind that I have never at any time denied that testimony or any part thereof. I also testify to the world that neither Oliver Cowdery or Martin Harris ever at any time denied their testimony. They both died reaffirming the truth of the divine authenticity of the Book of Mormon. I was present at the deathbed of Oliver Cowdery, and his last words were, 'Brother David, be true to our testimony of the Book of Mormon.'"
Nice imitation.
So I also like to hear, can you put it back up again?
Yeah.
So people will point to this one, they'll say, oh, on their deathbed, they said they stay true to their testimony. The thing that we're arguing.
Oh, okay, keep going.
I was just gonna say, the thing that they're arguing, I'm not trying to say that they didn't see the plates. I think they did. It's some kind of, but I think it was a visionary state. I don't think it was a physical experience.
You're saying neither of these statements negates the possibility that they still think it was spiritual.
Right.
So he could say that the Book of Mormon is divine because he believes somehow it was inspired by God. Freaking even progressive Mormons that don't believe the book's historical today are willing to say it's divine. So that's not a stretch at all.
Yeah.
And then he's saying he's never at any time denied. Even that statement, I've never denied it, doesn't mean that he denies it. It just means that he's saying he's never denied it.
Yeah.
So neither of those statements are conclusive, right?
And also it's like he of course he's never denied it, but that doesn't mean he's never changed his testimony, right? Doesn't mean that the story's not evolved over time. And that's really what most of the accusations actually are. Going back earlier to that one where he kind of pushed back in his pamphlet. It's like the guy wasn't saying you denied it. The guy was just saying the story's changed.
Right.
Yeah.
What I find interesting is as we're going to read through a lot of the statements from David Whitmer, is he's remarkably consistent over his life. There's a lot of consistency. If anything, I feel like it gets really repetitive and tedious as I go through it. But this is just to push back on them, that I think he shows a lot of consistency throughout his life. And I don't think he is changing his testimony or what he is recalling about that experience of seeing the angel in the plates.
Well, I mean, it's the same. This is what Nemo said earlier. It's kind of like a straw man argument because he knows he can't really address the spiritual versus natural, so he changes the argument to denying the testimony, which is an easy one to push back against.
David did acknowledge it a couple times, the spiritual versus natural. And I think we're just getting way too caught up on spiritual versus natural. It's clear that they believed it was both spiritual and natural. It's whether or not we believe it was real or if it was a hallucination. But they're very clear that it was both.
And I don't want to jump too much, but like this is why the historicity of the Book of Mormon is so important, because if the Book of Mormon is not historical, like you said, there are a lot of progressive members that go, well, it's not historical, but it's still from the divine. This whole story gets exploded if the Book of Mormon is not a historical record, and if this gets exploded, I mean, like that's why the church can never ever change the narrative that the Book of Mormon is not historical, but it's just like a revelation. I know they're trying to soften that, but to go full out that it's just a revelation, it's not actually history, it would completely undermine all of this. So all of these episodes are doing would be meaningless because it would just show how the story just completely crumbles underneath, and that's why they're in such a mess right now.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think while there's some people who may lean more towards the Book of Mormon just being inspired or inspired fiction, I think definitely Book of Mormon historicity, it's integral. Like the whole angel and the gold plates narrative does I think, crumble if the Book of Mormon is not historical. And in my series on the Book of Mormon, I did examine and dive into Book of Mormon historicity, evidences in favor, looking at the criticisms going against Book of Mormon historicity and the different responses to that.
This is Oliver Cowdery. A letter from Oliver Cowdery was published in the Gospel Luminary on December 10th of 1929. 1829. That reads as follows. You also wish Mr. Harris to inform you respecting his seeing this book, whether there could not possibly have been some juggling at the bottom of it. A few words on that point may suffice. It was a clear, open, and beautiful day, far from any inhabitants, in a remote field. At the time we saw the record, of which it has been spoken, brought and laid before us by an angel, arrayed in glorious light, who descended, I suppose, out of the midst of heaven. Now this is human juggling, judge ye.
That's one. What's number two?
So on April 13th of 1859, a report was published in the Deseret News from Reuben Miller. Reuben gives a report of Oliver Cowdery's speech at Council Bluffs, Iowa, on October 21st of 1848. According to this report, Oliver stated, I beheld with my eyes and handled with my hands the gold plates from which the Book of Mormon was transcribed. That book is true.
Wow.
Yeah, so all I wanted to point out here really was that he's handling this, whereas other accounts say that they did not handle them.
My view is that this is likely he's referring to seeing the plates whenever he had the vision of the angel, but then handling because he was the scribe as well. Both him and Martin Harris would have handled the plates during the translation process. So I don't view this as he's contradicting or changing his account. I do appreciate them sharing these two sources from Oliver Cowdery.
Just think that's really inconsistent. Yeah.
Nemo, why wow?
Well, the mainstream LDS belief is that the three witnesses did not handle it. Like I was kind of saying that thing earlier. The official account, what everyone was taught in seminary, is the three witnesses saw it and the 8 witnesses handled it.
Right.
Interesting. I've always been confused about which did what.
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
there's a reason you're confused.
Okay, got it. Good.
All right, so this one's from Edward Stevenson. This is his reminiscence, and this was published in the Millennial Star in 1886. Mike, do you want to read this one?
Yeah, it says, I have often heard him, Oliver Cowdery, bear a faithful testimony to the restoration of the gospel by the visitation of an angel in whose presence he stood in company with the prophet Joseph Smith and David Whitmer. He testified that he beheld the plates, the leaves being turned over by the angel, whose voice he heard, and that they were commanded as witnesses to bear a faithful testimony to the world of the vision that they were favored to behold, and that the translation from the plates in the Book of Mormon was accepted of the Lord, and that it should go forth to the world, and no power on earth should stop its progress.
Yeah, so the angels turn the leaves, they hear a voice, which I also think is interesting that they call this, they talk often about their hearing a voice, but if the angel's standing in front of them, that seems like an interesting thing to say, because the voice would be coming from the angel, I suppose. But also he calls it a vision. But then I had this thought as you're reading, Mike, that Joseph Smith, he calls his first vision a vision. So I guess the apologetic view could be like, oh, vision doesn't mean that it's not actually happening. But we've seen from David Whitmer and Martin Harris that vision does mean that it's not actually physically there.
I would push back on that as we read their other statements. If they use the language vision, they're not implying that vision means not real. And the voice which they heard, they're very consistent about, both in the official testimony and other statements, that they heard the voice of God. So that is the voice that they're referring to.
Yeah, but then, like you said, in Joseph's case, vision is almost shorthand for heavenly visitation.
Yeah.
Right.
So there could be a little bit of equivocating in there.
Yeah.
I'm curious why Oliver's number is 30 in terms of him being interviewed, and Martin's was 50 and Whitmer's was 70. Why is Oliver so relatively infrequent in terms of how many people asked him about what happened? And why is his account so consistent when the others are so inconsistent? Any theories on
Whitmer
that?
seems to me like the sort of guy who likes to run around bragging about this sort of thing. That's my take.
So, and the history of the church. So these are all like,
Official.
well, yeah, they're all official documents. Thank you. None of the three witnesses handled the plates. However, in 1831, David Whitmer testified that he went with Joseph to a field and handled the plates before setting them down again. And again, in 1848, which we just read, Oliver Cowdery said that he too handled the plates.
Yeah.
And years later, in his interview with Zenas H. Gurley, David Whitmer said that they neither touched nor handled the plates.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's why I was like,
Yeah. And then, so again, another inconsistency is where or when they saw the plates. Joseph Smith says that the three witnesses all happened on the same day, and we have some of that in the other witnesses' statements. But Martin Harris said on one occasion that about 3 days after David and Oliver saw the plates, he had his own witness of them after passing into a state of entrancement. Joseph Smith says that he and the three witnesses retrieved to, quote, a piece of woods convenient to Mr.
Retired.
Excuse me. The three witnesses retired to a piece of woods convenient to Mr. Whitmer's house. Yet both Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer said that they were brought to an open field with Joseph Smith and there saw the plates.
Okay.
So we're not sure on what day and we're not sure where.
Okay.
those
And
seem
then-
like pretty important facts to have straight. No,
Yeah, why
like,
would you not?
the
know?
specific details I can understand changing over time, particularly as things get later, but certainly where it happened and whether it happened on the same day as the others or not, you would imagine would be fairly consistent over time.
Well, and then with on which what I think is interesting is Martin Harris. Nobody else is with him except for Joseph when he has this vision, and he's the one that said it happened 3 days later.
Mhm.
But it was a late account, but it was him, and so I'm wondering, like, why are we? Like, I guess I would put more weight on his because he was the one that had the experience rather than everyone else.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, with regard to Martin seeing it 3 days later, I don't know about that because I did find a couple of accounts that talk about 2 or 3 days later. So possibly, I don't know about that because yeah, as we read through in the official history, it seems to all be like on the same day because Joseph then finds Martin off praying. But what I would say is when it comes to like, there's always going to be some outliers or some inconsistent statements as you view the historical record. Like just watch the episode I did in the Book of Mormon translation, and there's a whole host. While there's a lot of consistency, you're going to get some which don't align with each other. There's going to be some outliers. And I think if there's over 100, if there's around 150 statements from the witnesses given over decades, I would expect there to be some differences. But just because some statements talk about them, you know, sitting on a log in the trees, another one in an open field, that therefore means they didn't have their experience. I feel like that's not a good argument to make. And you could easily see it as like they were in a clearing. So, you know, there was a clearing in the woods. So that could be where they're getting the conflation.
It's a second hand.
Totally.
Right.
Okay.
Okay, so another inconsistency is what did they see? The official statement of the 3 witnesses says only that they saw the angel and the plates. In a revelation in June of 1829, Joseph Smith listed many items that they would see. Neither Oliver Cowdery nor Martin Harris ever described seeing a table when they obtained their vision of the plates, nor any of these other items.
Incorrect. I have an account from Martin Harris where he does talk about seeing the sword of Laban and the interpreters, only one. But she's right about Oliver Cowdery.
David Whitmer describes seeing many items on a table during this experience. However, only the plates are mentioned in the testimony of the 3 witnesses. And so then I'm just curious, why were they not also witnesses to these things? Why would the angels show them those other items in the first place? Why are the other witnesses silent on these items? So like if it's all a divine thing, why aren't they witnesses to those? Yeah.
And I remember talking to Grant Palmer about this. Like, how, if let's just say that Joseph was able to convince people they see things that they're really not seeing, how do you get everyone to see the same thing if they're seeing it in their mind's eye? You have to kind of plant and suggest, okay, I see an angel with gold plates. Do you see it, brethren? And then they're like, oh, okay, now I see it, right? You have to prime or prompt them or in some way coach or seed or shape what they're seeing, or else everyone's going to say they saw something different, right?
Yeah. I do think this quote from David Whitmer is quite important, and they do bring this up later. But he says, of course, we were in the spirit when we had the view, for no man can behold the face of an angel except in a spiritual view. But we were in the body also, and everything was as natural to us as it is at any time. Martin Harris, you say, called it being in vision. We read in the scriptures, Cornelius saw in a vision an angel of God. Daniel saw an angel in a vision. Also in other places it states that they saw an angel in the spirit. A bright light enveloped us where we were that filled the woods at noonday, and there in a vision or in the spirit, we saw and heard just as it is stated in my spirit, in my testimony in the Book of Mormon. I feel like he's clarifying, like, this was natural, like we were in the body. I think you can make a better argument for that when it comes to Doctrine and Covenant 76, the visions of the kingdoms of glory with Sidney Rigdon. There's no evidence to support that any of the witnesses talk about Joseph Smith doing that with them, just that they were praying, and then when they stopped, the angel came down and appeared before them.
They're brethren. And then they're like, oh, okay, now I see it, right? You have to prime or prompt them or in some way coach or seed or shape what they're seeing, or else everyone's going to say they saw something different, right?
Yeah, that's
With regards to why did they only primarily testify of the plates, that was the main purpose of what they're going to testify of, was the reality of the plates. They were showing these other objects, but I feel that the fact that it's not included in the official testimony, I don't find like problematic as well. This wasn't just in our mind, and that there's many people in the Bible, in the scriptures, who refer to seeing angelic visitors or messengers with spiritual eyes or in vision. But that does not take away the reality of it. The likelihood of audio and visual hallucination, all 3 of them having it, because the point he's making is, yeah, how on earth do you promise and prophesy that these 3 men will see the angels, see the plates? That's a very bold and overconfident thing, that they're going to have this experience, which they never deny throughout their lives. How do you get them to see it? So of course people would have to come up with some theories that Joseph was this skilled hypnotist or able to suggest to people to see things, and that they, just had this visionary mindset and were very susceptible to hallucinating things. But the statistical chance of all three having an audiovisual hallucination, of which they never deny throughout their lives, that's quite a that's almost as miraculous to me as there being a real angel appearing with gold plates.
That's exactly it. I mean, Martin Harris claimed he saw the morning of, he claimed he saw an angel in the field, and he was told he was called to be one of the witnesses. And then he, also said that, there's a story which kind of leads into the Mary Whitmer one, where he claims to see a man with a sack on the journey, and then they ask Joseph Smith who it is, and Joseph's like, oh, no, that's Moroni with the plates. I asked God, that's what he told me, and so then they say, oh, David Whitmer said, I feel like the plate's under the shed, and Joseph's like, yeah, dude, that's where I hit him. So you have all these kind of like little areas where Joseph's kind of preparing them for what you're going to see, and he's also kind of getting them kind of in line with like how they kind of need him to guide through these unexplained things. And so it makes sense that Joseph would be the constant between being there with Martin Harris separately versus, also being there with David and Oliver. And it just shows how without Joseph Smith, these visions don't happen. And that is very consistent throughout the early history of the church with so many other things as well.
The treasure digging stuff.
Field sort of goes against this theory because he made that point that without Joseph Smith, these visions don't happen. But then you have Mary Whitmer, who is an unofficial witness who claims to have been shown the plates either by, I think it was by Moroni as well when she was milking the cows, and Joseph Smith wasn't present for that.
Very good.
Okay, so then I have a whole list. I just got all the ones that we just read and I put them on this list. So in at least 10 accounts, the three witnesses did not see a physical angel with a physical set of plates, but saw only a vision of the angel in the plates. And should we run through these again?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is spiritualized vision stuff versus physicalized physical stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, let's read them.
Yeah, so Stephen Burnett, he says it was a vision or imagination, and that all hesitated to sign on already written testimonies. Jesse Townsend, Martin said that he saw the plates with his spiritual eyes. And from John A. Clark, we get that Martin saw the plates with the eye of faith. Anthony Metcalfe with Martin says that he passed into a state of entrancement and saw the angel in the plates. From John H. Gilbert, we get that Martin saw the plates with his spiritual eye. And from Reuben P. Harmon, Martin Harris saw them with only in a spiritual vision. And from John Murphy, David claimed that the angel had no appearance or shape, and that the experience was an impression. And from Anthony Metcalfe, David said, of course we were in the spirit when we had the view. From Zenas H. Gurley, we have that David said that they did not handle the plates, and it was only in a holy vision. And Edward Stevenson said that the witnesses were favored with a vision.
Julie, you left one out.
Wait, which one?
David Whitmer acknowledges Martin Harris saying that he saw him in a vision.
Yeah. So,
and that's actually David Whitmer himself, not a second source, right?
Yeah.
That's
so,
a pamphlet he published, right?
Yeah, that's true. In his own pamphlet. Yeah. So 11 accounts where they say that they're in a vision and it's not an actual experience that they're having. Yeah. I think I'm kind of in that boat right now where it's like, I don't really know, but it would not shock me if Joseph Smith did make a set of plates.
It almost seems, go ahead, Mike. You talk first, Mike.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, I mean, I think that makes the most sense because you have something under a cloth. And if you have people afraid to look at it because they think it's either going to kill them or it's going to kill you, then you can have something that people could see rustling, you can have carrying around, and it gives it that legitimacy. And then you have that kind of magical, you can't look at them thing, which allows you to have that kind of like prop without needing to have a past visual inspection.
Yeah, that would be the critical theory that Joseph Smith was somehow manufactured and created, fashioned his own set of tin plates, likely when he went and visited the hill. That's how he injured his thumb, was from bending the rings. And so he had 19th century metal plates that were covered in a cloth. But when the critics say that like he did that because he knew that the plates couldn't pass visual inspection, I feel like the 8 witnesses, which they'll probably get into the next episode, clearly state that they like visually saw the plates and saw the engravings as well, and the curious workmanship of some of the characters.
David Whitmer was also excommunicated in 1838 and later became the president of the Church of Christ, or the Whitmerite Church. David never rejoined the mainstream LDS Church. In a pamphlet he later published called An Address to All Believers in Christ, the one we've been reading from earlier, he stated that Joseph Smith claimed to have been visited by Peter, James, and John, and also John the Baptist. He claiming that did not happen until much later, believing that Joseph had made it up. He also did not believe in the 2 priesthoods, Melchizedek and Aaronic, and said that Sidney Rigdon helped Joseph to come up with that idea. He believed that Joseph Smith was editing Revelations. He also said that if you believe my testimony to the Book of Mormon, if you believe that God spake to us 3 witnesses by his own voice, then I tell you that in June 1838, God spake to me again by his own voice from the heavens and told me to separate myself from among the Latter-day Saints, for as they sought to do unto me, so it should be done unto them.
Okay, quick response to this. I think David Whitmer definitely did believe that Joseph Smith was a fallen prophet. Watch my video on the priesthood restoration, but I think it was quite adamant that it was quite clear that Joseph and Oliver didn't start talking about it until the early to mid 1830s. And I've also got a little clip here in response to David Whitmer being told to leave the church in Missouri. But when David Whitmer left the church,
He wrote this pamphlet to all believers in Christ, and he says, if you believe my testimony to the Book of Mormon, if you believe that God spake to us three witnesses by his own voice, then I tell you that in June 1838, God spake to me again by his own voice from the heavens and told me to separate myself from among the Latter-day Saints, for they sought to do unto me, so it should be done unto them. If David Whitmer is a credible witness, this is coming from a critic, why are we only using his testimony of the Book of Mormon while ignoring his other testimony, claiming that God himself spoke to Whitmer by his own voice from the heavens in June 1838, commanding Whitmer to apostatize from the Lord's one and only true church? So that's a good question. Why should we accept his testimony when it comes to the Book of Mormon, the gold plates, but then why should we not listen to it when he says that God told him to separate himself from the Latter-day Saints? Apologists have to say that David Whitmer had been excommunicated from the church for more than a month earlier, and his only he only continued association with the saints was that the fact he was still living with them. So this was after he was excommunicated, he still continued to live with them. Whitmer was not instructed to leave the church or repudiate Mormonism. He was instructed by God to leave Far West after he was already excommunicated. This was arguably by a very prudent course, both for Whitmer's safety, because I think there was a group called the Danites that probably were threatening his life, and the integrity of the Restoration witnesses. Whitmer's witness of the Book of Mormon and seeing the angel is much more powerful, since he forcefully maintained it even after he left the church and disagreed with Joseph Smith. So when reports being told by God to separate himself from among the members of the church, Whitmer was already out of the church, still living in Far West among the members of the church. So apologists would say it is when God told him to separate himself, it wasn't to leave the church because he was already excommunicated, but to separate himself, that he was living there for his own sort of safety.
Opposed to polygamy and accused Joseph Smith of having, quote, a dirty, nasty, filthy affair, close quote, with their live-in maid Fanny Alger sometime around 1833 to 1835, which now the church acknowledges as being true. That's me. Oliver Cowdery was excommunicated in 1838 for, quote, persecuting the brethren, close quote, and, quote, falsely insinuating that Joseph was guilty of adultery, which he actually was guilty of, and for, quote, not attending meetings, for, quote, selling his lands, not under the direction of Joseph Smith, and many other reasons that all seem manufactured to cover up the fact that he was accusing Joseph rightly of adultery.
Oh, yes. Joseph was accused by Oliver Cowdery of adultery. That was one of the things that was in his disciplinary council, and he also wrote a letter to his brother accusing him and Fanny Alger of having a dirty, nasty, filthy affair. You can watch the video I've done on Fanny Alger, because there's some accounts that support Fanny Alger being a plural wife. You have Eliza R. Snow, who was a roommate with Fanny Alger, referring to their relationship as a marriage. You have Mosiah Hancock as well. And also, I think it's Elizabeth Young, who Fanny, I think, moved in with them, referred to Fanny Alger as being a plural wife of the prophet. So depends what account you want to refer to. But yeah, it seems like Oliver Cowdery didn't believe or accept the plural marriage of Fanny Alger.
Later, Oliver Cowdery joined the Methodist Church, which is weird. Why is he joining that church when it's the one true church? And in the Times and Seasons in 1841, 2 lines were published that read, a Book of Mormon, not his word, because denied by Oliver, question mark. Now, let me read that again. In the Times and Seasons in 1841, 2 lines were published that read, quote, or Book of Mormon, not his word, because denied by Oliver. I don't understand that, Julia.
If you go to the,
Okay.
So I just have some questions that I want to ask. So many of the witnesses had strong, or things to point out, I guess. Many of the witnesses had strong motive to never deny their testimony of the Book of Mormon, as they continued to associate themselves with factions of the Mormon Church, and many later rejoining the mainstream church, except, and I guess you could say with the exception of Oliver Cowdery, who said by that witness, he said he was willing to deny, and by the Mormon publication in the Times and Seasons, he maybe did deny his testimony. And another point I wanted to make is being a witness to a foreign language that you are not knowledgeable about, even if it is engraved on golden plates, does not mean that the translation is correct.
Yes.
And we've made that point earlier.
Yeah, I agree when it comes to the 8 witnesses. Even if they were shown the plates and the engravings, that does not mean that they know that the translation is correct. I think it's different in terms for the 3 witnesses. And I would have to look into that source, but there's many accounts saying that Oliver never denied his testimony. And Martin Harris says on his deathbed that, he could have been a rich man had he have denied these things. I honestly think that they could have had more fame had they have exposed the fraud and been like a whistleblower and really saying that actually I think Joseph Smith did some sort of hypnosis on us and had some control over us.
And also, never denying your testimony of the Book of Mormon is not the same as never denying that you physically saw an angel with a physical set of gold plates. And I feel like that's one of the main things we've been trying to convey. Never denying your testimony of seeing an angel with golden plates does not mean that the angel and the plates were physically there. So,
yeah, that's true. They never deny seeing the angel in the plates. That's true. I think we're getting too caught up in the physical versus spiritual. But even if they believed it was physical, it was real, whether or not in a visionary state, she's right. That doesn't mean it definitely was. It's still faith, whether or not we believe them. They could have been mistaken. They just don't believe that they were.
That's another point we're trying to make. Never denying your testimony does not mean that your testimony is true.
If you think about, I'll just make scholar Richard Bushman, right? Obviously Richard Bushman is well respected. He's well loved, Harvard trained, Columbia professor, great scholar. Richard Bushman will never be more important anywhere else in the world than in a room of believing Mormons, because very, 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 very few people, even scholars, in my opinion, care about his work on colonial America, compared to the level of passion and care and gratitude that people have to Richard Bushman for writing Rough Stone Rolling, and basically for bolstering and affirming his faith in Joseph Smith as a well-respected scholar. And so you have to just realize that once somebody has reached the pinnacle of their fame, of their importance, of their relevance to a large group of people, why would they ever later on in their lives want to, like a balloon, pop a pin in that and have it go away? It's going to be the only thing that people really want to remember your name about. It's going to be the only thing you're relevant about. And it's going to be the only way you can get people to want to care that you're still around. And so in my view, just that alone, why else would Oliver Cowdery, why else would anyone have ever given an F about Oliver Cowdery, Martin Harris, or David Whitmer, aside from his association with this book? So for me, that's the biggest motivation for them to never deny its divinity, because it's literally the only thing they ever did that really mattered to anyone other than, let's just say, their immediate family. And that's my soapbox on that.
I think that is unfair and uncharitable to the witnesses, and I do disagree with that. I actually think the opposite. While yes, you could say they maybe had some fame and lots of people wanting to come and visit and interview them, and they got a lot of attention for their testimony, particularly when they were out of the church, I think that they could have gotten more fame by denying it. And even this statement from Martin Harris, he says in his final testimony, the Book of Mormon is no fake. I know what I know. I've seen what I've seen. I've heard what I've heard. I've seen the gold plates from which the Book of Mormon is written. An angel appeared to me and others and testified to the truthfulness of the record. And had I been willing to have perjured myself and sworn falsely to the testimony I now bear, I could have been a rich man. But I could not have testified other than I have done, and I'm now doing, for these things are true. And I believe that the primary reason and motivation for them continuing to bear their testimony throughout their lives of seeing the angel in the plates and never denying it is because that is sincerely what they believe, what they know they experienced. That is why, out of integrity, they could not deny it.
George Costanza, where he says, it's not a lie if you believe it. And I always think of that with this stuff, because someone will say like, oh, so you think the missionaries are just lying to people for 2 years? It's like, no, they're not. They don't think they're lying. They believe it. It doesn't mean it's true, though. And so I think that line always sticks in my head now, because of that, because it really, to most people, and it's true. It's not a lie if you really believe it's true. It's just that it doesn't mean that it's true.
So even if the witnesses truly saw a set of golden plates, like physical gold plates, this does not change the fact that during the translation process, Joseph Smith did not always use the golden plates, and they were not always in the same room. Much of the content for the Book of Mormon is anachronistic, i.e. Deutero-Isaiah or the Sermon on the Mount, etc. That there were thousands of changes to the text. I think the number is somewhere around 5,000. That it is not supported by archaeological or DNA evidence. That most of the ideas in the Book of Mormon coincide with material that was available to Joseph Smith at the time. And that scholars today acknowledge that the Book of Mormon is a 19th century text.
Yeah, full stop. And that's why y'all need to go back and watch the other 50 episodes of the LDS Discussion series if you haven't yet, because we've got 51 episodes where we go into deep discussion about problems with the truth claims of the Mormon Church and the Book of Mormon specifically.
Yeah.
So not true that the witnesses don't make a difference as to whether or not the book is true or not.
That's just it. Like, that's the whole point. And that's why I've been trying to tell you what we talked previously. It's like, to me, it's not that they don't matter because the church puts so much on them, but they don't matter if you're trying to assess if the church is true or not. And I think Julia so perfectly did that for me. So thank you.
Okay, and I think I understand that argument. People saying, well, look at all these arguments and reasons for why the Book of Mormon is not historical. Look at anachronisms, King James Bible material, Deutero-Isaiah, DNA, archaeological evidence. And yeah, I think if you're going to say, I don't believe the Book of Mormon is history, therefore I do not believe that the witnesses really saw what they saw, that's a very understandable position that you could take. However, in my Book of Mormon series, I want to really look at the 19th century influences or sources that people point to, the things challenging historicity, to look at the apologetic responses as well, but also take into account evidence in favor, such as the convergences with Old World geography, the cultural and religious context in 600 BC in Jerusalem, and how the Book of Mormon seems to align with that. Convergences in Mesoamerica, in my discussions with like Brent Gardner, some of the Book of Mormon complexity or ancient elements found in the Book of Mormon, geology in the Book of Mormon, and I think you can view the testimony of the witnesses as well as seeming like evidence in favor as well. Also ancient names in the Book of Mormon. So I feel like you need to take into account the evidence and reasons in favor as well as the criticisms against. But what we're going to do to finish is I'm just going to read through a lot of the statements of the witnesses. First, second, maybe a few third hand, but these are primarily their positive statements in the spirit of informed consent, because I'm trying to provide the things that I felt like they left out. The context that they left out were sources and statements that they didn't emphasize. I do appreciate, I think they did a fairly good critical analysis, but I didn't feel like it was a fully comprehensive or balanced analysis to the witnesses. And that's why I felt a need to respond as well. And if you're like me, I want to read all the sources, all the data I can get my hands on, and then come to my own conclusion and interpretation. And you do that with the witnesses yourselves. I think it's just important to represent their testimonies and what they had to say adequately. Okay, so what I'm going to do to finish is I'm going to read through a lot of the sources and statements, whether first-hand, second-hand, or maybe even some third-hands from the witnesses, which are either omitted, which were not discussed in the episode. Now, these are going to be primarily the faithful statements, and I'm not going to go over the ones that they went through in the episode, like from Stephen Burnett or Anthony Metcalfe. I have around 10 sources for Oliver Cowdery, 15 for Martin Harris, and close to 40 for David Whitmer. So I wasn't able to find the supposed 150 that Richard Lloyd Anderson says there is, and 150 would be way too much. But you're going to get, I think, a very good picture of what they claimed about their vision of the angel and the plates. And I'll probably provide minimal commentary unless I think it is necessary or connects with some things they said in the episode. Okay, and obviously you can watch and read the quotes as well, but I'm just going to read a lot of them and mainly what's just highlighted in yellow as the key part. So we're going to start with Oliver Cowdery. So he says in 1829, this comes from the Painesville Telegraph. He writes, "It was a clear, open, beautiful day, far from any inhabitant in a remote field. At the time we saw the record of which it has been spoken, brought and laid forth before us by an angel arrayed in glorious light, who ascended and descended, I suppose, out of the midst of heaven. Now, if this is human juggling, judge ye." So if this is juggling or trickery, saying very matter of fact, an angel arrayed in glorious light came down out of the midst of heaven, and there was in the midst of them. Oliver Cowdery was once asked, I've got this from Fair, was your testimony based on a dream? Was it the imagination of your mind? Was it an illusion? He responded with the exact same qualifying statements as the other two witnesses. Oliver Cowdery says, "My eyes saw, my ears heard, and my understanding was touched. And I know that whereof I testified is true. It was no dream, no vain imagination of the mind. It was real." So to him, it wasn't a dream. It wasn't an imagination of the mind. It wasn't juggling. It was real. That what he saw, what he heard, and what he testifies of. For a letter written in 1848, he says, "I beheld with my eyes and handled with my hands the gold plates from which it was transcribed. I also saw with my eyes and handled with my hands the holy interpreters. That book is true." And I think likely the reference to handling the gold plates and the interpreters is when Oliver was helping his scribe, but his seeing the plates was his vision of the angel. When Thomas B. Marsh was excommunicated as an apostle, he asked Whitmer and Cowdery to learn the real truth about the Book of Mormon, since they were now excommunicated with him. And this is what Marsh reported. "I inquired seriously at David if it was true that he had seen the angel according to his testimony as one of the witnesses of the Book of Mormon. He replied, as sure as there is a God in heaven, he saw the angel according to his testimony in that book. I asked him, if so, how did he not stand by Joseph? He answered, in the days when Joseph received the Book of Mormon and brought it forth, he was a good man, filled with the Holy Ghost, but he considered he had now fallen. I interrogated Oliver Cowdery in the same manner, who answered me similarly." So both David and Oliver, even after they'd been excommunicated and left the church, and both for a time believed that Joseph was a fallen prophet. David Whitmer actually never came back, and that was still his belief till the end of his life. Said, as sure as there's a God, we saw the angel in the plates, and they stay true to their testimony of the Book of Mormon. Because you think if they were just in on it, this would have been a prime time for them to maybe have denied or questioned if Joseph had done some sort of hypnosis on them. In an interview with Edward Stevenson, he says, Edward Stevenson writes in 1886, I have often heard him, Oliver Cowdery, bear faithful testimony to the restoration of the gospel by the visitation of an angel. He testified that he beheld the plates, the leaves being turned over by the angel, whose voice he heard, and that they were commanded as witnesses to bear faithful testimony to the world of the vision that they were favored to behold. Elizabeth Ann Cowdery, who was Oliver Cowdery's wife, she writes, my husband Oliver Cowdery bore his testimony to the truth and divine origin of the Book of Mormon as one of the 3 witnesses of the Book of Mormon. So her being Oliver's wife, she's saying that he always stayed true and bore his testimony of the divine origin and never denied it. Philander Page, son of Hiram Page, said he was present at the deathbed of Oliver Cowdery. Oliver conversed with the brethren and reaffirmed his testimony to the Book of Mormon and to be faithful to their testimony. In 1876, John Whitmer wrote a lengthy letter to Mark Forscott, which included the following. I have never heard him deny the truth of his testimony of the Book of Mormon under any circumstances whatever. Neither do I believe that he would have denied at the peril of his life. So firm was he that he could not be made to deny what he has affirmed to be a divine revelation from God. And that is about Oliver Cowdery from John Whitmer. This is a journal of a Shaker leader who talks about that they were visited by some missionaries. He talks about Oliver Cowdery and stated that he had been one who assisted in the translation of the Golden Bible and had seen the angel and also had been commissioned by him to go out and bear his testimony. There's another account where when the missionaries go forth and Oliver Cowdery bore his testimony to the administration of an angel at noonday. I've taken this from Latter-day Saints Q&A, what he has to say about Oliver's testimony. Oliver is one of the 3 witnesses who bore testimony that an angel of God came down from heaven. The 2 other witnesses made it clear that Oliver was a fellow witness with them, not the author of the book. If Oliver wrote the Book of Mormon, then one must ask, what was his motive? He received no fame, no money, no lasting power for writing the book, and for remaining silent about his true authorship. In fact, 8 years after the Book of Mormon was published, Oliver was excommunicated from the church. If there was ever a time to expose Joseph as a fraud, that was it. His chance to get even and declare who the true author was. But none of that happened. To the contrary, even though it was some years before Oliver returned to the church, he always remained true to his testimony. And that's true. Oliver remains true to his testimony of the Book of Mormon, of the angel and gold plates, despite being excommunicated and being away from the church for around a decade, eventually coming back at the end of his life, bearing his testimony on his deathbed. And the quote where he talks about that it was not human juggling, the angel came down, appeared from heaven, showed us the plates. It wasn't a vain imagination or a dream, it was real. At least to Oliver, it seems like he believes and he knows that he really saw the angel in the plates and stayed true to his testimony. And critics often like to focus on his excommunication as evidence sort of impeaching Oliver as an unreliable witness, that maybe Oliver was part of a conspiracy with Joseph, and that's sort of the argument when it comes to the priesthood restoration and visitations of John the Baptist and Peter, James, and John. And I honestly think the witnesses had much to gain from denying their testimony. It would be the equivalent of like an apostle in the LDS church whistleblowing that the church is a fraud. I know that they would be healed up in the ex-Mormon community. And I don't think Oliver had an incentive to continue the conspiracy and had probably more of an incentive to admit deception or the possibility that maybe there's some sort of hypnosis, that Joseph Smith sort of got them into this religious frenzy and trance, questioning the experience. But Oliver never denies his testimony he wasn't involved in a conspiracy. We'll talk about this later, but mass hallucination or conspiracy doesn't seem to be really supported by the evidence. It seems quite unlikely. Okay, so let's talk about Martin Harris, and we'll read through a lot of his statements. Now, we read before that they refer to spiritual eyes, spiritual vision, eye of faith, and those are scriptural words. Even having visions of an angel, there's lots of experiences in the Bible. So I don't see that as that necessarily means that it was just in his mind, it wasn't real. And as we read about these 15 statements I have for Martin Harris, I think he makes it quite clear. So in 1853, he says, I was the right-hand man of Joseph Smith, and I know that he was a prophet of God. I know the Book of Mormon is true. Then smiting his fist on the table, he said, and you know that I know it is true. I know that the plates have been translated by the gift and power of God, for his voice declared it unto us. Therefore I know of a surety that the work is true. And he says, as many of the plates as Joseph Smith translated, I handled with my hand plate after plate. Quote, so when Martin Harris came out of a meeting, he was beset with a crowd in the street, expecting that he would furnish them with material to war against Mormonism. But when he was asked if Joseph Smith was a true prophet of God, he answered yes. And when asked if the Book of Mormon was true, this was his answer. Do you know that the sun is shining on us? Because as sure as you know that, I know that Joseph Smith was a true prophet of God, and that he translated the book by the power of God. In the Painesville Telegraph, he told all about the gold plates, angel spirits, and Joe Smith, that he had seen and handled them all by the power of God. In 1869, a letter written to W.H. Homer, he says, young man, do you see that sun shining through that window? Just so sure as that sun shines and gives us light by day, and the moon and the stars give us light by night, just so sure I know the Book of Mormon is true. For I saw the angel, I heard his voice, I saw and handled the plates upon which the Book of Mormon was written. In 1870, he was interviewed by Edward Stevenson. Martin, I think, is sharing a time, and he says at the conclusion, they asked him if he really believed the testimony that he had signed in the Book of Mormon to be true. He replied, no, he did not believe it, but much to their surprise, he then said he knew it to be true. Another statement, this again coming from Edward Stevenson, gentlemen, what I have said is true from the fact that my belief is swallowed up in knowledge. For I want to say to you that as the Lord lives, I do know that I stood with the prophet Joseph Smith in the presence of the angel, and it was in the brightness of the day. In 1893, Martin Harris says, I can prove by the Bible the truth of the work, as well as being an eyewitness, for I saw the book in the angel's hands, and I also heard his voice. In 1870, with the interview with William Wadupes, he says, young man, I had the privilege of being with the prophet Joseph Smith, and with these eyes of mine, pointing to his eyes, he says, I saw the angel of the Lord, and I saw the plates, and the Urim and Thummim, and the sword of Laban, and with these ears, pointing to his ears, I heard the voice of the angel, and with these hands, holding out to his hands, I handled the plates containing the record of the Book of Mormon, and I assisted the prophet in the translation thereof. So he's pointing to his eyes, saying, with these eyes, I saw the angel in the plates. With these ears, I heard the voice declaring it to be true. And he's also talking about holding the plates as well, likely when he was a scribe. And interesting because David Whitmer talks about seeing not just the angel in the plates, but the Urim and Thummim, the sword of Laban, and those things are also mentioned by Martin Harris in this account. In the Saints Herald, Martin was asked, did you go to England to lecture against Mormonism? I answered emphatically, no, I did not. No man ever heard me in any way deny the truth of the Book of Mormon, the administration of the angel that showed me the plates. The Lord has shown me these things by his Spirit, by the administration of holy angels, and confirmed the same with signs following. 1874, 1875, from Theodore Farley. This is an account from multiple statements of Thomas Farley, and this was given by Theodore Farley Sr. at a priesthood session. He stated that he stood in broad daylight when an angel from heaven came down with the plates in his arms, and he stood side by side with the angel when the angel did turn over leaf after leaf of the book that had been translated into our language, that after the angel had shown him the plates and disappeared, he heard a voice from heaven that thrilled every fiber of his body, stating that the book had been translated by the gift and power of God, and not of man, and he was commanded by the Lord to so make that statement to the world, and he did. Now it was my privilege to hear Martin Harris relate that time and time again at our table. In an interview with John E. Godfrey in 1875, he says, after praying some time, the angel appeared with the golden plates, and I saw with these two eyes the angel stand with the gold plates in his hands, and I saw him turn leaf by leaf the plates of gold. And I also heard the voice of the Lord saying that these words were true and translated correctly. So while there's some statements from Martin Harris referring to spiritual eyes, there's been a few statements here that we've read where he points that these eyes saw the angel and the plates, that the plates were turned each leaf, and he heard the voice of the Lord saying that these things are true. In an interview with Alma Jensen, it's there's an account that says, "Now I don't believe, but I know the Book of Mormon to be true. For with these eyes I saw the angel, and with these ears pointing to them, I'd heard him say it was a true and correct record of an ancient people that dwelt upon this, the American continent. And I hereby testify to you young men that it is true." Account I got from Richard Lloyd Anderson. Martin Harris says, "Gentlemen, do you see that hand? Are you sure you see it? Are your eyes playing a trick or something? No. Well, as sure as you see my hand, as sure did I see the angel and the plates." And this really does not sound like second sight, spiritual eyes. I just imagined it in my mind. He's saying, like, I saw it before you, as sure as you see the sun in the sky, as sure as you see my hand before you. There's another account which I don't have, but he talks about, like, do you see that chopping block? And as sure as you see the chopping block, I saw the plates, and I chop off my head before I would deny it. So these quotes, Martin Harris seems to be emphatic that I really did see the plates and the angel. Letter of Edward Stevenson to the Millennial Star. It says, "We have always taken you to be an honest, good farmer and neighbor of ours, but could not believe that you did see an angel. Now, Martin, do you really believe that you did see an angel when you were awake? Gentlemen, what I have said is true, from the fact that my belief is swallowed up in knowledge. For I want to say to you that as the Lord lives, I do know that I stood with the prophet Joseph Smith in the presence of the angel, and it was the brightness of the day." And this is one of Martin's final testimonies from George Godfrey. "The Book of Mormon is no fake. I know what I know, I have seen what I have seen, and I have heard what I have heard. I have seen the gold plates from which the Book of Mormon is written. An angel appeared to me and others and testified to the truthfulness of the record. And had I been willing to have perjured myself and sworn falsely to the testimony I now bear, I could have been a rich man, but I could not have testified other than I have done and am now doing, for these things are true." And summarizing Martin's statements, he says he knows, similar to Oliver Cowdery, that he saw the angel and he saw the plates. He saw with his eyes and he heard with his ears. It was real to him. And while there are other quotes that talk about spiritual eyes or it being a vision, this does not take away, as David Whitmer said, that they were in the body also, that they saw with their natural eyes, but they had to be spiritually prepared, and that there was a visionary element to it. But reading these statements, Martin Harris seems to be very clear that he knows he saw the angel in the plates. Okay, let's jump to David Whitmer. So this is going to be the longest section because he's got a lot of statements. So William McClellan, in his journal in July 1831, says, "David Whitmer then arose and bore testimony to having seen a holy angel who made known to him the truth of this record, and all these strange things I pondered in my heart." In 1872, this is from the Deseret News, "I visited Mr. David Whitmer, one of the witnesses of the Book of Mormon, and heard him bear testimony that he saw the angel of God, and heard him declare that the plates were divine record." In 1875, in an interview in the Chicago Times, "No man can look at David Whitmer's face for a half hour while he charitably and modestly speaks of what he has seen, and then boldly and earnestly confesses the faith that is in him, and say that he is a bigot or an enthusiast." So even this coming from a secular person from the Chicago Times believes that David Whitmer is sincere, that he sincerely and earnestly believes what he is confessing about the angel and the plates, whether or not he did or not. In 1876, this is reported by Thomas Wood Smith, "In most positive language," so he's saying that he has heard David Whitmer in most positive language, "that he did truly see in broad daylight a bright and most beautiful being, an angel from heaven, who did hold in his hands the golden plates, which he turned over leaf by leaf, explaining the contents here and there." So that other quote where it talked about, like, oh, did the angel have any form? No form. It was just an impression. This is going against this quote where he's saying that I saw an angel from heaven who came in broad daylight. There was a brilliant light and was shown the plates, each leaf. An account by Edward Stevenson. "We walked through a clearing and all sat on a log. It was about 11 a.m. when a light appeared and it grew brighter until an angel stood before us and on the appearance of a table was laid the plates. A voice declared and bore a record of the truth of the translation, turning the leaves over and over. Thus the vision ended." Another account by Edward Stevenson. "We passed through a clearing and sat in a log, which grew brighter and brighter until an angel stood before them with the plates and other things. The angel turned the leaves so that we could see the engravings, We then heard a voice saying that those things were true and that the translation was correct. In an interview by P. William Poulsen, David Whitmer says, Martin Harris is correct. We saw it, and our testimony, which we give to the world, is true exactly as you read it. We saw by the gift and power of God, as we were praying, the angel stood before us in his glory. And all those things were before us, as they were laid before us on a table. And we heard the testimony about the plates, and we were commanded to bear that testimony to the world. And our testimony is true. And when the angel had finished his words and shown us the plates one by one, which were to be translated, then the vision was closed at once. In an interview with Orson Pratt and Joseph F. Smith in 1878, he says, we, the three witnesses, not only saw the plates of the Book of Mormon, but the brass plates, the plates containing the record of the wickedness of the people of the world, and many other plates. The fact is, it was just as though Joseph, Oliver, and I were sitting right here in a log, when we were overshadowed by a light. It was not like the light of the sun, nor like that of a fire, but more glorious and beautiful. And I heard the voice of the Lord as distinctly as I ever heard anything in my life, declaring that they, the plates, were translated by the gift and power of God. Orson Pratt asked, did you see the angel at this time? David Whitmer, yes. He stood before us. Martin Harris was not with us at this time. I don't think he saw all that we did, but our testimony, as recorded in the Book of Mormon, is strictly and absolutely true, just as it was there written. David Whitmer to Mark H. Forscott in 2nd March 1875 says, my testimony to the world is written concerning the Book of Mormon, and it is the same that I gave at first, and it is the same as shall stand to my latest hour in life. Linger with me in death, and shine as gospel truth beyond the limits of life, among the tribunals of heaven. And this is from David Whitmer to Heman C. Smith on the 5th of December, 1876. My testimony to the Book of Mormon is true, and I am admonished neither to add nor take away from my testimony already appended to the book. So he's definitely reaffirming the testimony that is found in the official testimony of the witnesses, but there's a lot more. In 1879, this is published in the 1879 Saints Herald. I have heard the same from the mouth of Father Whitmer more than once. Every time I have ever heard him tell the particulars of that glorious scene, he always told it just the same. And as far as I have ever heard from reliable witnesses, he has always told the same story. As you read my testimony given many years ago, so it stands as my own existence, the same as when I gave it, and so shall stand throughout the cycles of eternity. In 1881, David Whitmer, a proclamation, and this comes from Dan Vogel's Early Mormon Documents. He says that the world may know the truth. I wish now, standing as it were in the very sunset of life and in the fear of God once for all, to make this public statement, that I never at any time denied the testimony or any part thereof, which has so long been published with that book as one of the three witnesses. Those who know me best well know that I have always adhered to that testimony. No man may be misled or doubt my present views in regard to the same. I do now again affirm the truth of all my statements, and then made and published. He that hath an ear to hear, let him hear. It was no delusion. What is written, and he that readeth, let him understand. So he's clarifying that he has never denied his testimony of seeing the angel and seeing the plates. And while they said in the video that maybe David Whitmer's testimony has changed over time, as we go through the rest of the statements, it's very consistent and emphatic. And it was no delusion, trick, or hallucination to him. In an interview with the Chicago Times in 1881, he's asked, did you see the angel? Yes, he stood before us. Whitmer, Joseph, and Oliver. Our testimony is recorded in the Book of Mormon is absolutely true, just as it is written there. What you see is true. Testify to the same they were told. At that time, Mr. Whitmer saw the tablet, gazed with awe on the celestial messenger. He was told, what you see is true, testify to the same, and Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer, standing there, felt as the white garments of the angel faded from their vision, and the heavenly voice still rang in their ears, that it was no delusion, that it was a fact, and they so recorded it. In 1882, this is an interview with William H. Kelly and George A. Blakesley. He says, we then kneeled down and prayed. Joseph prayed. We then got up and sat in the log and were talking, when all at once a light came down from above and then encircled us for quite a little distance around, and the angel stood before us. He was dressed in white. This is all that I heard the angel say. and spoke and called me by name and said, Blessed is he that keepeth his commandments. This is all that I heard the angel say. A table was set before us, and on it the records were placed. While we were viewing them, the voice of God spoke out of heaven, saying, The Book of Mormon was true, and that the translation was correct. How do you know it was the voice of God? We knew it was the voice of God. I knew it was the voice of God, just as well as I knew anything. In an interview with Jonas W. Chatburn in the Saints Herald in 1882, we asked him if his testimony was the same now as it was at the time the Book of Mormon was published regarding seeing the plates and the angel. He rose to his feet, stretched out his hands, and said, These hands handled the plates, these eyes saw the angel, and these ears heard his voice, and I know it was of God. That was the strongest testimony I ever heard, and I felt that he was telling the truth. I feel like that's quite powerful and emphatic. In an interview with Joe Smith III and others on 4th of April 1882, in answer to questions by the brethren, he recited with graphic distinctness the scene in which he received the testimony he bore many years past, I think it should say, and still bears to the Book of Mormon, and have averred anew that the statement made by him as published in the book is true. No one who listens to him can doubt the sincerity and truthfulness of the man. David Whitmer to St. Mouch on the 18th of November 1882 says, My testimony is published in connection with the Book of Mormon is true, and why should men ask to know more in regard to all the particulars connected with that overshadowing truth? In an interview with James H. Hart on the 21st of August 1883, he says, I have been visited by thousands of people, believers and unbelievers, men and ladies of all degrees, sometimes as many as 15 in one day, and have never failed in my testimony. And they will know someday that my testimony is true. I heard the voice of an angel, just as stated in said book, and the engravings on the plates were shown to us, and we were commanded to bear record of them. We were commanded to bear record of them, and if they are not true, then there is no truth. And if there is no truth, there is no God. And if there is no God, then there is no existence. But there is a God, and I know it. In an interview with James H. Hart, he also says in 1883, there was a glory attending it that no one could describe. No human tongue could tell the glorious scenes that were presented to them. In 1884, in an interview with Joe Smith III, when asked, this is David Whitmer's response, if he had been mistaken or had simply been moved upon by some mental disturbance or hallucination, which had deceived them into thinking they saw the personage, the angel, the plates, the Urim and Thummim, and the sword of Laban. This was suggested by Colonel Giles, and this is his response. How well and distinctly I remember the manner in which Elder Whitmer arose and drew himself up to his full height, a little over 6 feet, and said in solemn and impressive tones, No, sir, I was not under any hallucination, nor was I deceived. I saw with these eyes and heard with these ears. I know whereof I speak. So again, he's reiterating that he knows what he saw. He saw it with his eyes, heard with his ears. He knew what he experienced. It wasn't a mental disturbance or a hallucination. It was real, at least real to him. In an interview with Frank McDowell on 8th of May 1884, he says, I saw the angel as plainly as I see you. He was surrounded by the glory of God, which overshadowed us, and we heard his voice, and we saw the records of the Book of Mormon. My testimony is the same as at the beginning, and is true. Another interview with James H. Hart on the 10th of March 1884, he says, Oliver never wavered in his testimony, and when he was on his deathbed, I was there with many of his friends until he passed away. He bore the same testimony on his dying bed that he had always borne through life, and earnestly called upon all to cleave to the truth revealed through the prophet Joseph, and to serve the Lord. As for myself, I have never denied my testimony that is published in the Book of Mormon. In an interview with E.C. Briggs in 1884, he says, in June 1829, I, David Whitmer, saw the angel by the power of God. Joseph, Oliver, and I were alone, and a light from heaven shone around us, and solemnity pervaded our minds. The angel appeared in the light, as near as that young man. My testimony of the Book of Mormon is true. I can't deviate from it. In an interview with an unknown reporter in 1884, he says, I saw this apparition myself and gazed with awe on the celestial messenger, and heard him say, Blessed is the Lord, and he that keepeth his commandments. Then, as he held the plates and turned them over with his hands so that we could see them plainly, a voice that seemed to fill all space was heard, saying, "What you say is true. Testify to the same." Oliver Cowdery and I, standing there, felt as the white garments of the angel faded from my view that we had received a message from God, and we have so recorded it. In an interview with Franklin D. Richards in 1885, he says, "I did see the angel of God and was commanded to testify if these things are there true. Read the printed testimony of the three witnesses, which you will find on one of the front pages of the Book of Mormon, and I say to you that every word of it is true." In 1886, in an interview with Edward Stevenson, he says, "As I live and stand upon the earth, so sure did I see the angel who stood before us. While we were sitting upon a log, that is Joseph and I and Oliver Cowdery, we were talking when a bright light began to shine around us. It grew bright and brighter until an angel stood before us. We also heard a voice commanding us to bear a testimony of these things to the world." In an interview with Nathan Tanner in 1886, I asked him if the table which the angel brought and upon which the plates lay when he viewed them was a tangible one. He said that he did not touch it. It had the resemblance of a table. He then explained that he saw the plates and with his natural eyes, but he had to be prepared for it, that he and the other witnesses were overshadowed by the power of God and a halo of brightness indescribable. So he's talking about, like, yeah, it was their natural eyes, but they had to be prepared for it, that they were in the spirit as well, that you can't see an angel without being in the spirit, and that they're overshadowed by the power of God and a halo of brightness. If this wasn't part of them seeing the angel, there being this visionary, this brilliant, undescribable light, I always think, like, this doesn't sound like a heavenly visitation. In June 1829, in All Believers in Christ, he says, "The Lord called Oliver Cowdery, Martin Harris, and myself as the three witnesses to behold the vision of the angel as recorded in the forepart of the Book of Mormon, and to bear testimony to the world that the Book of Mormon is true. I was not called to bear testimony to the mission of Brother Joseph any farther than his work of translating the Book of Mormon." So even though he doesn't believe that Joseph Smith, he believes he was a fallen prophet and had issues with like the priesthood restoration changes made to Revelation, he was called to be a witness to the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon and the gold plates, which he never denies. David Whitmer to Sister Gates on the 11th of February 1887 says, "Of course I would tell you about my vision of the angel. You asked me if I saw the angel when he brought the plates. I saw the angel when he brought the plates, and the angel told us that we must bear testimony to the world." The Omaha Herald in 1886 says, "Can you explain the supernatural power that surrounded you?" David Whitmer says, "All of a sudden I beheld a dazzlingly brilliant light that surpassed in brightness even the sun at noonday, and which seemed to envelop the woods for a considerable distance around." And he says, "I felt chained to the spot, while I also experienced the sensation of joy absolutely indescribable." In 1887, to Robert Nelson, he says, "I did see the angel as is recorded in my testimony in the Book of Mormon. The book is true." In 1888, to Anthony Metcalfe, "In regards to my testimony to the visitation of the angel who declared to us three witnesses that the Book of Mormon is true, I have this to say. Of course we were in the spirit when we had the view, for no man can behold the face of an angel except in a spiritual view, but we were in the body also. And everything was as natural to us as it is at any time. Martin Harris, you say, called it being in vision. We read in the scriptures Cornelius saw in a vision an angel of God. Daniel saw an angel in a vision. Also in other places it states they saw an angel in the spirit. A bright light enveloped us where we were that filled the woods at noonday, and there in a vision or in the spirit we saw and heard just as it is stated in my testimony in the Book of Mormon." In 1888, reported by B.H. Roberts, David Whitmer, stated that the Book of Mormon was true, that his statement in connection with that of Oliver Cowdery and Martin Harris was strictly correct. He had nothing to add to it nor to diminish from it. In an interview with Edwin G. Woolley, this is from his diary, he says, "During our interview, Mr. Whitmer reiterated his testimony as given at the beginning of the Book of Mormon, saying that all he testified to there was true, that he had seen the plates and the heavenly messenger as he had stated." Apostate William E. McClellan wrote, I saw him, David Whitmer, June 1879, and heard him bear a solemn testimony to the truth of the book, as sincerely and solemnly as when he bore it to me in Paris 3rd in July 1831. So this is coming from an apostate, William McClellan. This is 48 years later that his testimony was as sincere, as solemn as it was when the Book of Mormon was first published. James Moyle, who was later Secretary of the Treasury in 2 US administrations, begged of him not to let me go through this life believing in a vital falsehood. Was there any possibility that he might have been deceived in any particular? No question about its truthfulness. To have been insincere seems impossible. It would have made him a hideous, soulless mental deformity. I'm sorry, that's what James Moyle said, because David Whitmer just reaffirmed it. When asked about did he see them with his natural eyes, David Whitmer said, I've been asked if we saw those things with our natural eyes. Of course they were our natural eyes. There is no doubt that our eyes were prepared for the sight, but they were our natural eyes nevertheless. The Richmond Democrat also added this comment, skeptics may laugh and scoff if they will, but no man can listen to Mr. Whitmer as he talks of his interview with the angel of the Lord without being most forcibly convinced that he has heard an honest man tell what he honestly believes to be true. So when another anti-Mormon published an article claiming that David had denied his testimony, David printed this proclamation. It is recorded in the American Encyclopedia and the Encyclopedia Britannica that I, David Whitmer, have denied my testimony as one of the 3 witnesses to the divinity of the Book of Mormon, and that the 2 other witnesses, Oliver Cowdery and Martin Harris, denied their testimony to that book. I will say once more to all mankind that I have never at any time denied that testimony or any part thereof. I also testify to the world that neither Oliver nor Martin Harris ever at any time denied their testimony. They both died affirming the truth of the divine authenticity of the Book of Mormon, even under gunpoint. I have a quote here from John P. Green. When the mobs again assembled, they went to the houses of several of leading Mormons, including David Whitmer, told them to bid their families farewell, for they would never see them again. Then, driving them at the point of the bayonet to the public square, they stripped and tarred and feathered them. The commanding officer then called 12 of his men, ordering them to cock their guns and present them at the prisoners' breasts, and to be ready to fire when he gave the word. He addressed the prisoners, threatening them with instant death unless they denied the Book of Mormon and confessed it to be a fraud, at the same time adding that if they did so, they might enjoy the privileges of citizens. David Whitmer hereupon lifted up his hands and bore witness that the Book of Mormon was the word of God. The mob then let them go. David told Heman Smith that on command of the mob to renounce his testimony, he nevertheless reaffirmed in the face of death. As David told James Hart, the testimony I gave to that mob made them fear and tremble, and I escaped from them. One gentleman, a doctor, an unbeliever, told me afterwards that the bold and fearless testimony borne on that occasion, and the fear that seemed to take hold of the mob, had made him a believer in the Book of Mormon. Conclusion on David Whitmer: there is large quantities of evidence of supporting David's reliability as a witness, the consistency of his statements, decades of confirmation, and even when threatened, tarred, and feathered, he didn't recant his testimony. And because he left the church, he might have had more of a bias to deny. And I just want to say that as I read through a lot of these statements from Oliver Cowdery, Martin Harris, and David Whitmer, collectively in totality, they are absolutely adamant that they know they saw the angel in the plates and heard the voice of God, that it was shown to them, that they saw with their eyes and heard with their ears, that it was not juggling, a trick, a mental disturbance, a hallucination to them. They know it was real, and they stay true to their testimonies throughout their lives. We can, I think, get really caught up on the words about spiritual eyes or vision, but that is their testimonies. And I think it's really important, whether or not you want to believe it was a hallucination or believe it was just something they imagined, that could be correct. They could be mistaken. But it's important to represent their testimonies, that they are sure they know what they saw and experienced, and they stay true to it throughout their lives. And I personally feel that if critics just focus on a few second or third hand statements and make it seem like, well, this is what the witnesses actually said about their experience of seeing the angel in the plates, and omit all of these statements, I think that's misleading. I don't think that's being transparent or fair to the witnesses about what they believe they experienced, what they know they experienced. I've not seen a vision. I don't know if they really did see the gold plates. It's faith whether or not we accept it or not. But as many people said, they seem sincere. They sincerely believe it. You can tell they're heartfelt, good, honest men who have this experience, who never deny it throughout their lives, despite leaving the church at times. And I think their testimonies are powerful. I think they need to be taken seriously. Particularly like if you are a Christian who believes in God and angels and supernatural things, this can't be dismissed, particularly the unlikelihood of a mass hallucination happening, which Joseph Smith prophesied in the Book of Mormon, that all three witnesses would happen to see the angel and the plates and other objects and never deny it throughout their lives. That is just an incredible thing to pull off. Is it possible that maybe they could be telling the truth? Now, of course, I can understand why people would examine Book of Mormon historicity or the text, and if they come to the conclusion this book is not historical, that they lean more towards this being a 19th century text, then of course you have to explain away the witnesses. But I personally feel that the most intellectually honest thing to do is to acknowledge that these men say they know they saw and handled the plates, that they saw the angel, saw the plates, heard the voice of God, and it was real to them. But just say, well, I don't believe it was. It was a hallucination, even though they were adamant it wasn't. But to focus on and cherry pick a few second, third-hand statements, I personally feel is misrepresenting what they claim. And when we combine this with the testimony of the 8 witnesses who do talk about seeing and handling the plates, and I know they're going to do an episode on them, and I'll probably do a response, as well as informal witnesses, the combination of supernatural and natural witnesses, to me, I think, combined together, is definitely evidence or case for the plates being authentic. And particularly as I read through all of these statements from the witnesses, I see their sincerity. They seem sincere. They honestly believe it. They're absolutely certain of what they experienced. And I think they need to be taken more seriously and not just brushed off as being these religious nuts who just claimed everything was spiritualized and they just saw it in their mind. That is not correctly representing their statements. And that they had just this terrible character that many people upheld that they were good, honest men with integrity, who particularly Oliver and David had very successful careers and were upheld by others in their community. But people almost find it hard to believe how they could believe this delusion. Obviously, if people want to side with the critics, I think that's fine. If you feel like the Book of Mormon isn't what it claims to be, you don't believe in God or Jesus or angels, then I totally understand rejecting their testimony. But the point of this was to provide a more comprehensive view of their statements and context that I believe that they left out in their analysis. And I hope if you take both of these episodes, there will be more informed consent. You'll be more informed on the statements of the witnesses, what other people had to say about the witnesses as well. Thanks so much for watching. Like, share, and subscribe if you would like to donate to support for me to keep going, keep doing more interviews, more research, more episodes, more series. Please support me, and I would like to also upgrade my camera, mic equipment, all those sorts of things. And there's a lot of time and energy that goes into this. Any donations are appreciated, but just keep watching, and thanks so much. If I was to recommend one resource on the witnesses, this would be it. Investing in Book of Mormon Witnesses. LDS Truth Claims has some good episodes on the witnesses as well. And I'm also going to make the last hour or so, where I went through all the witnesses' statements, its own episode as well, because I think it's really important for people to hear those. Thanks so much for watching. Take care. Bye.
Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.